Buenos días.
Good morning. Sorry for the slight delay, especially if you are joining us online. Without further ado, we will start the second day of this Research with Gender Dimension conference by giving the floor to the General Director of Innovation, Agurtzane Martínez, from the Government of Navarre. Good morning, everyone. Egunon. Firstly, I'd like to thank ADItech for putting together this conference, placing the focus on this topic, the inclusion of the gender dimension in research, as it is very much needed, and because it has been ignored systematically in all the research done in this country and in the world, and how this has affected women, the fact that this has been ignored, how women are affected by research in different areas. From our Department for Digital Innovation, this is a line of work that we consider very interesting, and we are working on it, and of course, we are not alone. There's a growing interest. Other administrations, such as the Ministry of Science and Innovation, are also working to place the focus on this issue. And we have some examples, such as the launch of the Equality Unit, Women in Science Unit, or the Observatory that they've launched, and which is represented here today. From our department, this is a line of work that is very relevant, and we put a lot of effort. So we have measures which are attracting and boosting this topic, and also part of the responsibility of not placing the focus on research and how it affects women is the lack of women being there in the teams, in the research and development teams, so that their standpoint is not included in research. From our department, we work on 3 lines. Firstly, how does the scientific community proposes new initiatives in their draft documents? Well, we request that they have an inclusive language so that there are no gender roles included, and they should lead to a reflection whether on their proceedings they are systematically having a role, a gender role or a gender gap in their proposals. Also, we try to foster the presence of women in research, and with different means, by integrating to our subsidies, to incorporate talent in research centers, businesses with subsidies, when women are recruited, or with measures to end with inequality. Also, we have lines of works to foster the presence of women in research lines, for example, Planeta STEM program, and with our support, and the support to Women in Science Chair, or this line of work, this funding line, rather, for strengthening the link between science and society, to submit proposals fostering the presence of women in STEM degrees. On the other side, we've made a step to introduce the women's vision in research within the subjects, within the content of research. So in the last call, the most important call we did from our DG for collaboration projects in R&D, we request that this is included, how research affects women, so that there is a gender perspective to see how research affects women instead of men, or maybe if they need, they can justify that this dimension is not relevant. This has been launched, and we had divergent response from different sectors. As you might imagine, one of the best responders to this gender dimension vision within research was the healthcare sector. Last year's call, there were 13 projects for healthcare. 11 of them included this content, this gender perspective in their content, rather, which is okay. So within the healthcare sector, this has been taken into consideration, something that didn't happen before. So solutions that were ready to market were not well prepared in this sense. So this is evolving. On the other hand, there are other sectors where this standpoint is not included. As for renewable energies, there were 11 projects, and none of them included the gender perspective in their proposal. Well, this is only logical, as these topics are less prone to including this. It might not be relevant how a new development affects women, for example, when new materials for wind turbines are being developed, but gradually we will see increasing research where this is relevant. And in fact, in other areas, for example, automotive and mechatronics, 10 projects were received and one included the gender perspective in the research content. So, unlike in the healthcare sector, this is not a majoritarian standpoint, but it is being included, and we need to foster that. So we see there's some light at the end of the tunnel. There's work that has been done, but still work that must be done. Luckily, we have the Equality Institute in Navarra helping us with several measures in our calls, but we have plenty of work to do, and we need to go a step forward, or rather, step beyond. We need to think of other types of gaps, discriminations, which are not exclusive to women, but rather complement this discrimination with other discriminations. So we need to work on this, we need to progress, and all together we might achieve that this gap and this gender, this dimension that is not included in this research, well, comes to an end, and research is really for everyone. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy today's conference. Thank you. Okay, so now we continue from Madrid. We have Zulema Altamirano, Director of the Women and Science Unit of the Ministry of Science and Technology in Spain. Zulema, the floor is yours. General Director for Innovation of the Government of Navarre, DG for the Equality Institute in Navarre, and dear participants, good morning, everyone. Thank you to ADItech for inviting our ministry to participate in this conference about research with gender dimension. Thank you and congratulations. Congratulations to all the centers and representatives that have joined this project to integrate the gender dimension in the RD&I, and also to the government of Navarre for their commitment with science and innovation, and also for progressing on equality in these sectors. And first, my apologies for not being there today. On September 30th, the minister visited Navarre and saw firsthand the task of the system agents of RD&I center. Also, she visited different technological centers and the biotechnical sector, and also she met with the president, Maria Chivite, the regional president, and both agreed that talent needs to be able to work and transform our country. That talent can't leave half of the population behind, and that's women. Also, contribution to science must benefit both women and men alike. That's why conferences like today's one are so important on our side from the ministry. We are also putting all our effort. In the action plan that we've drafted, we want to dignify, to foster, and to recognize people working on this front. That's our main project, and this includes especially women. So in the minister's speech from September 23rd, before the university, she started by saying, imagine that our Santiago Ramón y Cajal, instead of being a man, was a woman. This would be a Nobel laureate, the mother of the current neuroscience. And thus, the minister announced the mainstay of our policies so that women can consolidate their researching career in their city and transferring knowledge to society without having to choose between being a researcher or a mother. So there were main messages. First, attracting and retaining talent. Second, progressing in equality. Third, dissemination and science that reaches out to society. And then fourth, using science as the backbone of our community. And then from our department and from our laboratory, we work to make a reality these commitments through a dual strategy. First, with the gender perspective in a cross-cutting way in all policies arising out of the ministry. For example, we have the Spanish strategy for science and innovation and the state plan for scientific, technical, and innovation research that has been passed recently. And then, by strengthening this pending debt with female researchers, with the specific measures for them to revert the situation. To start with this, what we do at our unit is to do an X-ray of the current situation in science, innovation, and technology in Spain with our report, Female Researchers in Science. And we see that only 30% of female students go for the STEM degrees, especially engineering or technology. Regarding research, well, the women are a majority, 53% of PhD doctorates are women, and we are 5% points above the European average. However, this researching career becomes an obstacle race just for the fact of being women. So we analyzed the situation of young female researchers in Spain, and we saw the mobility, conciliation, instability, and funding issues are some of the barriers affecting mostly female researchers. As a result, they will gradually drop out of their careers. They won't keep on progressing at the same pace that their male colleagues. So women start being a majority before they become researching staff with 41%. One of the most concerning issues is that just a few make it to the top, to decision-making roles, and only 25% of them, or rectors or professors, are women. Only by adding up women's talent, we will have economic progress and well-being. According to the last Closing Gap report, if we reached a real equality situation in the job market, the GDP in Spain would have increased in 2019 over 18%. That's why we need brave policies to change these data, to change the reality. And that's what we are working on the ministry. We are trying to reform the science law so that we include the gender perspective in a cross-cutting way. In a recent program for women and engineering, the ministry announced the launch of a mentorship program for young female researchers. That's where we want to work, to contribute to this very much needed change. And thirdly, from the ministry, we will be very self-demanding when it comes to the fulfillment of the equality plans And under the Horizon Europe project, also we will use an gender equality label as an award to those centers including this dimension. And this would include an assessment on how the gender dimension is being included in the content of their research. We will work to ensure that we have inclusive, safe, and egalitarian working environments. We will also foster female technological entrepreneurship with a call with 5 million euros to foster projects which are led by women in technology and science. And lastly, we will also working on research with gendered research. We know that the content in R&D and I is improvable, and only 23% in 2019 of the proposals sent in to the Spanish Research Institute included this. And this is not enough, because we can't ignore that the needs, traits, behavioral patterns of women are different. Ignoring the different needs for research and results is a scientific issue with huge social connotations. And that's why we need clinical trials, ignoring those that include that perspective. There's a recent study. Only 4% out of 4,000 research studies related to COVID, only 19 considered those differences between men and women. And we all know that we need to tackle this. And to do so, in line with today's conference, we are also working from the Ministry to double up our efforts on the training and assessment efforts to include the gender dimension in those research studies, and also in the knowledge transfer, with a real direct and indirect impact on the social reality. And I'd like to wish you a great deal of success, because your success will be everyone's success. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now I will give the floor to Eva Istúriz, Managing Director of the Navarre Institute for Equality. Good morning, Egunon. I'd like to congratulate ADItech for their very valuable work. And yesterday was very interesting, and it was food for thought. Thank you, Marusha, for being so kind, for all the work you put in, and for being so kind when you deal with us. And also, I'd like to thank the department with Burchale, Brusco, and also the technical staff of the Navarran Equality Institute, making this collaboration possible for many years. So while preparing this speech, I remember that just 20 years ago, I started working on equality, and I remembered María Ángeles Durán, a seminal figure in equality. It was the first time I've ever heard a speech about gender and women, and she said that the glass was half full or half empty, and it was in the eye of the beholder. So when we talk about, and this is very often the case in equality and research, how do we look at this glass? And I find it surprising, because for 20 years ago, no one would have imagined that we would be here today in such a quality, in a conference of this quality, talking about all sectors, and this is applicable to all sectors: healthcare, maths, so the glass is half full. But then, given the COVID crisis and the research which has been done on the very low number of publications by women and this perpetuation of the caregiver role, we see the care gap, and the care gap is affecting research, and that means that many women couldn't publish as much as their male colleagues during the pandemic. And it's very important that we remember this. Otherwise, as both our colleagues remembered yesterday, then the androcentrism is at the center of everything. Man is the reference of everything, and women, however, represent 51% of the population. We are the majority. And very often we are called a collective. Luckily, the feminist movement, dating back to 300 years, has allowed us to have regulations so that we can ensure social justice and excellence in science. Well, there's a Spanish law, the 17/2019 on equality, talking about female researchers as researchers, but also as a subject of study. And this is very important, that we have the national law, but also the regional law on research and technology, talking about the gender perspective. Also, the SDGs include the equality dimension and the cross-cutting nature of equality. Both our colleagues yesterday shared examples of how these regulations, these laws are turned into a reality. Because sometimes in equality we talk about the laws, but they showed examples of how can we fulfill and abide by the law. So we talked about disaggregated data, gender analysis, correcting measures, and ADItech, I think, is a good example of how we turn this work into a reality. On the one side, they have the research forum, and then, some help subsidies to include the gender perspective, and then they have an internal equality plan that is, and this is one of the correcting measures we've mentioned before. And then they organize this excellent conference, and it's a pleasure to be here as they help us progress. I think it's also important that social sciences are taken into consideration. When we use the word science, it seems that it's only part of knowledge. So I think we should stress the importance of ADItech's efforts. And to wrap it up, I'd like to pay homage to another woman, Concepción Aderal. Everything is impossible while it seems impossible. So when she went to university, disguised as a man, and I think if she was here today, she would be very happy to see that we wear trousers because we want to, and not because we have to, like she had to. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Eva. Now we'll connect with Denmark. I don't know if Mathias Wullum can hear us from Denmark. Mathias is Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Copenhagen, Denmark. He is a sociologist by training and holds a PhD in social sciences from the University of Aarhus. His research focuses on social and gender stratification in science. His thesis, New and Persistent Gender Equality Challenges in Academia, was defended in 2015, after which he conducted postdoctoral research in gender innovation at the Stanford University. Mathias was recently part of the European Commission's Gendered Innovation 2 expert group and has published numerous articles on the topic of gender in science.
Mathias, whenever you are ready.
Thank you very much. So thanks so much to the organizers for the invite. I'm very excited to participate in today's conference, and I've been asked to do a talk on methods for integrating the gender dimension in research. So in my presentation today, I will introduce the Gendered Innovations Project, which is an ongoing interdisciplinary endeavor that seeks to harness the power of sex, gender, and intersectional analysis for innovation and discovery. And the core purpose of the project is to demonstrate how sex and gender analysis can add valuable and new dimensions to research and innovation. Another critical point which should not be forgotten is that sex and gender analysis can be very critical in strengthening the precision and the validity of scientific research, as I'm sure will also be clear from the many important and interesting presentations today. So the Gendered Innovations Project has two general goals. First, it seeks to develop methods and approaches that enable engineers and scientists to integrate sex and gender and intersectional analysis into their own research. Second, it seeks to develop empirical studies that help illustrate how the integration of sex, gender, and intersectional analysis can lead to innovations and new discoveries. And if you're not already familiar with the Gendered Innovations Project, I would strongly encourage you to visit the project's website. If you look up Gendered Innovations in Google, it will show up as the first suggestion. So on the website, you will have direct access to an abundance of knowledge, methods, and recommendations on how to best integrate sex and gender analysis in your own research. In 2019, the European Commission asked Professor Londa Schiebinger at Stanford University, who's leading this project, Gendered Innovations, to put together a team of international experts to promote the integration of sex and gender analysis in the Horizon Europe Framework Program. And Sabine, Roa, Ines, and Meike, who will also be talking today, and myself including, we're all part of this expert group and have in different ways sort of contributed to the policy report that you see here, which in accordance with the core principles of the Gendered Innovations Project develops methodological tools and case studies that help support the advancement of sex and gender analysis in the European research and innovation areas. In this expert group, Sabine Oertelt-Prigione, who will be speaking in a moment, and I and two other colleagues from Europe had the task of developing a common methodological framework to help researchers capture the sex and gender dimensions in the project. And the pie charts presented here, which can be attained through the report, they visualize the core logic of the methodological framework. Our goal has been to sort of succinctly summarize the key aspects of sex and gender analysis at each stage of a research process, from the initial considerations of problem choice to the development of methodological designs, to data analysis, and to the reporting of results at the end of this stage. One of the central principles of gendered innovations and gendered innovations inspired projects is that sex and gender analysis needs to be taken into consideration already from the beginning of a research project. So trying to retrofit sex and gender into a project at the end stage will rarely lead to anything useful. As you can see here, we have developed pie charts for both sex and gender. And these pies have primarily been developed as sort of an entry point into sex and gender analysis. The purpose here is to give people that are new to these methods a general overview of the most important questions to consider in each phase of their projects. The most recent Gendered Innovations report published by the European Commission earlier this year also includes a method on intersectional approaches, which follows the same logic. In this method, we also offer concrete suggestions on how to make intersectionality an integrated part of your research project, from the initial considerations of problem choice to the reporting of your results. More importantly, the Gendered Innovations Project includes a number of field and discipline-specific methods that provide more detailed instruction on how to consider sex, gender, and intersectionality in your work. In health and biomedicine, for instance, these field-specific methods include sex and gender analysis in biomedicine and health research, sex analysis in research on tissues and cells, and sex analysis in lab and animal research. In the domain of information and communication technologies, we cover gender and intersectionality analysis in machine learning and in social robotics. And likewise, we have also specific methods in the domains of climate change, urban planning, and innovation. As part of the most recent updates of the Gendered Innovations Project supported by the European Commission, we also included a method that outlines the state-of-the-art approach for collecting data about sex and gender in surveys. So the usual way of collecting sex and gender information in surveys is via the one-step method that you can see here shown to the left in the screen. The problem about this method is that it conflates sex and gender and leaves no response options for respondents that do not consider themselves to be male or female. Gender researchers are therefore increasingly relying on the two-step approach to asking about sex and gender in surveys that you can see here on the right. This approach asks about sex at birth and gender identity in two separate items and includes more inclusive response options for both the sex and gender question. Finally, let me also briefly highlight a few additional resources that some of you might find useful as an entry point into questions of sex and gender analysis. In 2019, 3 members of the European Commission's Gendered Innovations Expert Group, Kara Tannenbaum, Robert Ellis, and Londa Schiebinger, published a landmark paper in Nature that compellingly outlines the potential for sex and gender analysis in order to sort of improve the validity of scientific research and foster new discoveries. The paper serves, I think, as an excellent entry point into this domain of sex and gender analysis. And in addition, I see this paper as a much needed reference that we can all point to when we need to convince colleagues, university leaders, project partners, and so on the importance of systematic attention to sex and gender in scientific research. If Nature acknowledges the importance of sex and gender analysis, they should too. So those of you working in the areas of health and medicine may also want to check out our recently published paper on gender-related variables for health research. In this paper, I, together with colleagues, psychologists, medical researchers from Europe, the US, and South Korea, we try to take a first step towards developing a more fine-grained and multidimensional survey measure of gender for use in clinical medicine and population health research. So our goal here is to capture 7 variables related to gender norms, gender-related traits, and gender relations. And the goal is that these variables can be used to shed light on how specific gender-related aspects contribute to health disease processes, irrespective or in addition to biological sex and self-reported gender identity. So this was my brief introduction. I hope you will all have a look at the Gendered Innovations website, read the European Commission's report based on this expert group's recommendations, because this provides a very useful resource for engaging with sex and gender analysis. Thank you.
We'll now continue with Sabine Oertelt-Prigione. She is a doctor, a consultant. She is a professor in the University of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and she's also a lecturer in Germany in the University of Bielefeld. She has studied different aspects in sex and gender, covering sex differences in self-autoimmunity or gender differences in cardiovascular disease or sexual harassment. Apart from her academic activity, she was a member in the expert group Gendered Innovation, and she was also a consultant to different organizations in relation to discrimination prevention and harassment. Sabine, you have the floor. Thank you, but I would rather speak in English, and I can take questions in Spanish too.
Let me see. I will switch to English because it's easier, but as I said, if you will have questions later, I understand Spanish quite well. So, okay. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the gender dimension in COVID research. Since, of course, we all have had unfortunate encounters with this pandemic for the last 2 years. It was already mentioned in the introduction how much it impacted so many different layers of our work and our lives. And I will specifically focus on 2 points here. So some of you might be familiar with the gender dimension as it is used by the European Commission. And what the European Commission addresses is 2 layers. So one is the context layer, where they address gender balance in scientific careers, which was mentioned before, for example, with differences in publication abilities during the pandemic. And the second layer is gender balance in decision making, so who is on a team. And then the third layer is what we will be mostly talking about with the examples from gendered innovation, which is sex and gender analysis in research and innovation, so what we are practically doing. And I will start with talking a little bit about content, and then I will also switch for a few minutes to the context. So what happened with the COVID pandemic? For people like me who've been working in the field of sex and gender sensitive medicine for quite some time, it was probably the first time I did not have to convince people to look at sex and gender or the fact that it was important. Because right from the beginning, and this is a somewhat older slide simply because the new data from this website, which I can only recommend, which is Global Health 5050, don't fit in a slide anymore. So this data showed right from the beginning that when you look at the male to female ratio of death for COVID-19, there is a higher mortality in men. And this was pretty much detailed everywhere in the world. Although we have to take into account that this data has mostly been hospital-based, especially initially, and once different measures, for example, death in nursing homes were also counted, we saw a slight change in this. But if we look at the global data, there seems to be a higher mortality in men. This was maybe one of the reasons that prompted people to start looking a bit more at sex and gender differences. I always wonder how it would have been if it had been the other way around. Nevertheless, we can only talk about this if we have disaggregated data. And as you can see here, unfortunately, we don't have sex disaggregated data from all countries or at all moments in time. And what I mean by that is the countries you see in green here are the ones that reported data on cases and deaths disaggregated by sex in the past month in this case. In yellow are the ones that have reported some of this data disaggregated by sex, and in red are the ones where we don't have information about whether there are differences in infections or differences in people dying because of the disease. So even if from the beginning we knew there seemed to be effects of sex and gender, this did not automatically translate into acquisition of sex disaggregated data. Following that, however, we started seeing quite some research from the beginning into the potential effects of immunological differences in this disease. So we know that the receptor for the virus is the ACE2 receptor, which is based on the X chromosome, where females generally have 2 chromosomes and males only have 1. So there seems to be a potential advantage in that. We know that the molecule that helps the virus enter the cells might be controlled by hormones. And we know that when it comes to the immunity, the immune response in women seems to be somewhat more intense and more vigorous than the one in men. I'm of course simplifying this, but just to give you an overview of what are the different steps we're knowing. And we also see that the production of antibodies who can help in this immune response might be different between females and males. So we are seeing some research into that. And we have seen that gender and sex differences have been reported also in symptoms. So we know in general, if we look at data from all over the world, that men reported more often symptomatic disease. They required more intense and invasive therapy when they were hospitalized. So they more often needed to be intubated, or they might have needed to go to intensive care unit. And as I said initially, they died more frequently of the disease. However, our emerging data on long COVID, so on persistence of symptoms even after the initial infection has resolved, seems to be, for what we know now, more prevalent in women compared to men, and especially in postmenopausal women compared to men. However, this is an evolving field of research, and we're still in the early phases and trying to really get a definition also of which symptoms are part of it, how long this symptomatology lasts, and if and how it can improve over time. So this is a developing question. But again, we are seeing some differences when it comes to symptoms and to persisting symptoms. So we assumed, and this is work done together with Mathias, who you've just heard, and other colleagues in Denmark, that since there was so much attention in the media for sex and gender differences in COVID-19 right from the beginning, we should have seen this attention also in the research processes. So we looked at clinical trials that were registered in the very large American database clinicaltrials.gov, where international clinical studies are registered, between January 2020 and January 2021. And unfortunately, what we found was that only about 1 every 5 studies explicitly stated at registration that they would look at sex and gender upon recruitment of their participants, and only about 1 every 20 studies said that they will explicitly consider that in their analysis. Now, one can always say, well, these registrations are done early, people don't spend a lot of attention and time on this, and then when the study is really done, everything improves and everything gets better, and eventually all of this will be done. Well, unfortunately, this is not true. And we have looked at the 45 pharmaceutical clinical trials, so the ones that were analyzing medications in January 2021, who were published in the biomedical literature. And yes, there is an improvement. We moved from 1 every 20 studies to 1 every 5 studies that reports some form of sex disaggregated analysis. Now, if this was just a problem of time and not wanting to spend too much time on the recruitment protocol, we should see 100% here. And yet we're still below 20%. What we were hoping to see was also that this would improve over time, because as I said, the media kept talking about it. There was quite some discussion in the society about the impact of sex and gender. And yet, if we look at how these registrations went over the year, you see that pretty much nothing changed. So although we kept hearing about this in the media and we kept having information about this, this did not necessarily reflect in the trials. And what this shows us very clearly is that simply talking about the subject will not automatically lead to the implementation or to the change in our research practices. We need much more clear regulations to have this happen. Now, a few points about the context when it comes to COVID-19, because of course, initially we have focused on the medical aspects and on the clinical aspects of the disease. But of course, what we were seeing already right from the beginning and then more and more, and that we're seeing now, is that, of course, such a pandemic can affect pretty much all aspects of our lives. And what we're seeing here, actually this of course should be a 9 and not a 0. What we're seeing here are the different dimensions that are being affected by COVID-19. I was asked initially in the context of the Gendered Innovation Project to write a case study for the EU Commission about COVID-19. This was not planned in our activities because when we started, there was no pandemic yet. So it was done later on and added to the materials. And what this simply shows you is that all domains of our lives, as we know by now, can be affected by such a pandemic. It can affect the economy, for example, who are the essential workers, which industries suffer. It can affect politics, most importantly, and who manages such a pandemic, such an emergency, and who gets to decide which politics are being implemented, who takes care of people, who takes care of children, who takes care of elderly, who takes care of sick persons at home and at work, who gets to innovate. You know, we have this slogan, build back better, but who gets to build back better? Who is being heard when we do that? And of course, we have had a pandemic of violence, mostly domestic violence, for most importantly, when countries went into lockdown and people were not allowed to leave their homes for long stretches of time. I just want to show you two brief examples. One is, well, the work and care allocation. And as I said initially, this was already mentioned when it came to the working patterns of academics. A lot of women academics did produce less papers during the pandemic because they also had to do unpaid care work at home. And this is data from the International Labour Organization before the pandemic, where you see that even in non-pandemic times, the share of unpaid care work done by women worldwide on average is 4.5 hours, while that done by men is about 1.5 hours. Now, how did this change during the pandemic? And this is an investigation done during the first wave in Italy. 520 heterosexual couples were asked during the April 22 lockdown how their working and care patterns changed. So, and what you see before is these are working women with a partner who say that, well, I did more housework and I did more childcare than before, but the housework increased a little bit more than the childcare. And the partners of these women said, I did more housework and I did more childcare, and the childcare increased more. If you simply look at this figure, you would say, oh, this is actually not too bad. So apparently there seems to be some sharing and there seems to be quite some division of labor going on. However, you need to look at the hours that these people are starting with before COVID-19. And if you look here again at the partners, you see that most of them, 20%, and then these are more than 50%, spent between 0 and 1 hour on housework and childcare before the pandemic. While if you look at the working women with these partners, most allocate themselves in the 1 to 2 hours, and you see that then there's an even spread between some that say a little less and some that say some more than that. Only 1% said 0 hours. So if we start with this and then we look at this increase, it becomes, of course, clear that since the baseline was already different, these hours have to be read in a quite different way than we would if we only looked at that. I already mentioned politics, and this is one paper that I think sums it up really nicely. This was an analysis of the amount of women and men in COVID decision-making bodies around the world, where 87 countries have been included. And although there are a lot of national pledges about wanting gender-inclusive decision-making bodies, only 3.5% of these 115 identified decision-making bodies had gender parity. And this gender parity was between 40 to 60%. So they didn't want exactly 50-50. They had a laxer index between 40 and 60% of each. While 85%, and this might not be surprising to most of us, had a majority of men participating. And this, of course, is important, as I said before, when we think about the management of a pandemic, the questions that are being asked, and the priorities that are being defined when political decisions are being made. So overall, I hope I have given you some food for thought and some initial ideas to keep in mind when we think about sex and gender, because what we see is that the content of the research work that we do is very much linked to the context of the things happening around us that influence the content we can be producing and the questions we're asking to produce that content. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Y ahora invito a subir al estrado a Raül Andero. Él es profesor de investigación ICREA de la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona y nos va a contar su fascinante investigación. Un momento. Voy a abrir tu presentación. Y tú me indicas qué pasa. ¿Quieres? Espera. Un momento. Segundo.
Buenos días. Estoy encantado de estar en estas jornadas y quiero agradecer la invitación al comité organizador, especialmente a Marusha. Y hoy os voy a hablar de un ejemplo sorprendente de cómo un fármaco disminuye la memoria en animales de laboratorio, en machos, y la aumenta en hembras. Entonces, es muy sorprendente que estemos en el año 2021 y se haya descubierto esto. Siguiente, por favor. Primero tengo que decir que tengo una patente relacionada con fármacos, de los que voy a hablar hoy, en las cuales podría tener conflicto de intereses. Mi laboratorio investiga el miedo, siguiente por favor, siguiente, en el que el miedo lo definimos como una amenaza que va a venir a hacernos daño. En cambio, me gusta diferenciarlo de la ansiedad, porque la ansiedad es una respuesta a una amenaza que podría venir o podría no venir. Me gusta la definición de miedo y ansiedad del doctor Michael Davis, en el que, bueno, de manera técnica explica un poco que el estímulo de miedo viene rápidamente y se va rápidamente, mientras que los estímulos de ansiedad pues están más permanentes en el tiempo. ¿Por qué es importante estudiar el miedo? Porque los trastornos relacionados con el miedo son importantes para el trastorno de estrés postraumático, los trastornos obsesivos compulsivos, las fobias, la ansiedad generalizada. Es decir, hay el mal funcionamiento en el cerebro del procesamiento del miedo puede llevar a desarrollar diferentes trastornos psiquiátricos. Es sorprendente que las mujeres presentan más alteraciones de los trastornos del miedo, como el trastorno de estrés postraumático o el pánico o el trastorno obsesivo compulsivo. Las mujeres tienen casi una probabilidad 2 veces mayor de desarrollar estos trastornos. No se sabe si es por causas biológicas o ambientales, seguramente las dos. Algo no muy comentado en la literatura biológica, que se suelen atribuir estas estadísticas a factores biológicos, puede ser las condiciones más duras en las que los estresores más duros a los que pueden estar involucrados las mujeres, porque los trastornos de miedo están altamente relacionados con exposición al estrés. Entonces, una cosa que es sorprendente es que en los animales de laboratorio que se utilizan para testar fármacos antes de que se den en personas y que desafortunadamente son imprescindibles, por eso, por ejemplo, tenemos vacunas por el COVID gracias a los animales de laboratorio, aunque las mujeres tienen más trastornos relacionados con el miedo, todavía la mayoría de estudios se siguen haciendo con ratones macho. Y la típica razón que se suele aducir es que las ratonas hembra o ratas son más variables porque tienen el ciclo estral, que se llama, que es diferente al ciclo menstrual de las mujeres. Esto lo hemos oído siempre, incluso lo oímos en la calle. Bueno, es que la mujer es variable cuando tiene el periodo y todo esto. Bueno,
we commonly hear it with ordinary people, and how this reality, if we apply it to science, is not true, because if we notice the chart, there are differences in the behavior. There aren't any differences in the behavior of male and female mice, so there is no reason for researchers to use only male mice versus female mice. In actual fact, we should use both sexes, or we should use the most adequate sex, depending on the particular disorder. It's obvious to me, absolutely obvious. One of the advantages in studying fear-related disorders with animal models is the fact that brain circuits between mice or animals and humans are highly preserved, because fear is indeed an ancient feeling and sensation. You can imagine how essential it is to both animals and humans, and this has been the case for years and years on end. The amygdala, for instance, is one of the main brain areas that is involved. Similarly, out of every 5.5 studies using neuroscience, only one uses female mice, but things are improving slowly but surely. This slide is from 2010, but there's still a long way to go in having a more balanced composition sex-wise. Here we see the variability of female and male brain. It is similar. Are there differences between, a male and a female brain? I'm sure you have heard neuroscientists saying there are no differences. Male and female brains are the same. We can do the same things, we have the same skills. Well, it depends on a number of things. If we take a photograph of a brain, in this case with magnetic resonance, men, since they are larger, the average brain of a man is 11% bigger than that of a woman, because usually men are larger than women. An expert that works with magnetic resonance on a daily basis, however, shall not be able to find differences in the actual brain of a woman or a man. But I'm talking about the architecture of the brains. But there are differences, of course, between a woman's brain and a man's brain. Of course, hormones and molecular biology. I'm talking about the proteins and the genes involved in brain processes. Sexual hormones, we always hear women are very variable because they have a menstrual cycle, which is fairly well known. But something that is not that well known is the testosterone cycle, or testosterone cycles. In fact, I've chose the one which is more similar to a woman's cycle. This is a 30-cycle day for a man with the testosterone hormone, and it does change. It is highly variable, isn't it? And there are also seasonal changes from February to June. In fact, there is an increase, a 4% increase in testosterone with men. And even on the same day, if we compare the morning with the night, men have different testosterone levels, and those testosterone levels may vary greatly if I play a tennis match and I win or lose the game. So women are said to be highly variable. It is commonplace for many of us, but this is ignored for men. That goes for sexual hormones, but here you find a molecular biology picture. The reason I'm showing it to you is because the same memory set for an animal, a laboratory animal is done with different proteins, but the result is exactly the same memory being created. So there are differences between a female and a male brain in this case. This was confirmed by us in this article. We published it this year. It had a huge impact on the media, nationally and internationally. In this study, we discovered that with laboratory animals, if you give them exactly the same doses and the same drug on a female mouse, the memory is increased. On a male rat or mouse, it decreases. When we first noticed this back in 2017, we thought this must have been reported before in the literature, no doubt. So we inquired with international experts, but oddly enough, we were the first ever to discover this in the history of laboratory science. Why wasn't it discovered? Because it was not tested. It was not done with a female mouse with this particular drug. But I'm sure this is not the only case for this drug. I'm sure it happens with other drugs. And most interestingly, in female mice, we managed to describe that during the estrous cycle, which would be sort of equivalent to the menstrual cycle, the drug could work in some portions of the cycle and not in others. And with male mice, it was also associated to testosterone levels. So when you study these things, you realize these drugs could be successful or not based on hormone levels. This is a technical summary of the paper, of the study. In this area of the amygdala, which is the area most related to our memory of fear, when we apply an antagonist of the receptor in female mice, estradiol goes up, and which molecules which are related to our memory, while in males, the opposite happens. Testosterone levels go down, molecules related to our memory, to their memory, and therefore the memory of that event. What is this drug all about? Well, the drug is called oxanetant. It was tried years ago to treat schizophrenia, and unfortunately, it was found not to have beneficial effects on this condition or a better result than the drugs applied at the time. Years later, we applied it to mice for a totally different application if compared to the original application. And the advantage we saw is that these results with laboratory animals could be achieved with people now, anytime now. We would just need the tablet. The two basic ideas I would like to share with you are very simple. One, are all drugs available at pharmacies and chemists the same for men and women? Do they work the same? We know they don't work the same, but is that studied sufficiently? And question number two, during the menstrual cycle, the same drug could have differential effects, and the same for men during their high and low testosterone levels. Do drugs work the same? The answer to these questions is no. But please don't panic, don't worry. Please do not think, do not question, what we already have at the chemists. We, of course, have the guarantee of the European Medication Agency, and, of course, clinical trials are conducted and completed properly. But it's important to take into account that drugs are first studied with male mice, and then when they are transferred onto humans, differential effects are not studied on men and women, which is a shame because, in fact, we could have drugs which could be at some point more beneficial to women and at some point more beneficial to men, and therefore have more successful research. I'm sure the European Medicine Agency do an excellent job, but we would have to take our studies further to try and determine the effectiveness of a drug. I don't mean to say, you know, drugs are harmful, not at all. What I'm saying is that we ought to include sex analysis in our research to enhance our research and for us to discover drugs that we cannot discover because we do not study sex differences. And another idea I want to go through to you is something that is done in other fields, such as cancer, possibly because investment is heavier there than in mental disorders. We ought to have more customized medicine, including variables such as age, weight, genetic variables, environmental variables, and so be able to reach or develop drugs. And this is done to some extent. Professionals do it with the tools they have at hand, but more research is needed, more investment is needed to be able to be more accurate and so better differentiate treatments for mental disorders, trying to be a lot more specific and therefore more successful. These are my acknowledgements. I would like to say thank you to my team, to my research team, to all those who collaborated, to the sponsors and investors. Thank you for their work. And thank you very much for your attention too. Raul, please stay with me. We are now going to move on to Irene Miguel, but once Irene finishes, we will have a few minutes for questions, so I encourage you to think about questions. Irene Miguel-Aliaga is a lecturer in Imperial College in London, and she also works in the Medical Science Institute in London. She completed her PhD in Oxford University and also in Harvard, the United States. She set up her own laboratory in Cambridge University, and at this moment in time, she is enjoying an ERC Advanced Grant and an ERC Starting Grant. Irene is going to do her presentation in English because she has lived in England for a very, very long time. You have the floor. Thank you. Thank you, Marusha. Thank you very much for your invitation and for organizing these seminars. It's so very important to have a broad discussion about sex and gender perspectives. As Marusha said, I apologize because I will present in English because my whole research career has taken place in English, and I don't quite, I'm not that proficient in Spanish with a technical term.
Hopefully you can all see it. So I think you've already heard quite a lot about how organs that we may not have considered to be different between the sexes are in fact very different from, for example, functional perspectives. So I guess I'm here today to illustrate this, again, from a very different perspective. And this perspective is that of the intestine, right? So we think about a gastrointestinal tract. And in particular, the kind of work that we do in the lab concerns how the gastrointestinal tract communicates with other organs. So you may have heard and you may have even watched on TV, because it's a very hot topic, a very popular topic, that our gastrointestinal tract can communicate with our brain. So it's not just that the brain talks to our gut, but the gut also talks to our brain. And you may have heard as well about the microbes that live within our gut and also communicate with other organs. And this communication is very, very important for various things. So we know that it controls food intake, it controls how fat we get, it controls our immune system, and it can even control our mood, how happy we are. This communication is very complex from a mechanistic perspective. So we and others have done a lot of work now for many years trying to understand what controls this communication. And we now know that some of it is mediated by nerve cells, so nerve cells that live in our gut. So we don't only have nerve cells in our brain, we also have nerve cells in our gut. And the gut also produces hormones. It produces hormones that signal to other organs, such as the brain. So this is a very active investigation in many very different labs, but over the years, we've all assumed that these intestines are the same between males and females, right? And that's one question that we asked ourselves a few years ago. And in fact, if you open a human anatomy book, you'll see that the only sex differences in anatomy that you find are those in the reproductive system. So obviously, it's quite clear anatomically that a female and a male reproductive system are very different. But when you open the pages to do with the digestive system, it's not really separated between males and females. So everyone assumes that a male intestine is the same as a female intestine. So historically, nobody really has ever considered whether organs such as the intestinal or gastrointestinal tract are different between the sexes. But we in fact know that most gastrointestinal disorders are sex biased. They have different incidence and different prognosis, whether we looked at males or females. And in fact, most of our physiology is also sex biased, right? So many aspects of how much we eat or how we respond to sugars or how we store fats, they're all different between the sexes. So that's something that we felt was worth considering. And our entry point into investigating this was slightly unusual, so slightly non-canonical. So you've already heard about model systems such as mice from Raül in the previous talk, but actually we decided to use another experimental system, and this is the fruit fly Drosophila. So you may be initially surprised that we actually use fruit flies to address these questions, but in fact, fruit flies, and in particular Drosophila, have been used for over 100 years now to explore many aspects of how we are made and how we function. And this is because they're very similar to us. So we share about between 60 and 75% of our genes are shared with flies. But obviously they have many experimental advantages. So they're very cheap to breed, and they have a very short generation time, so we can do things very quickly. And in particular, for the kind of work that we do there, it's very easy for us to turn specific genes or specific nerve cells on and off. And we can do that with temporal and spatial control, and then we can see what happens. And we can do it with many genes at a time. So when we're looking at a process of interest, for example, sex differences, we can very easily find the genes that matter for this particular process. So this is just what a fly room is. This is a lab, what it used to look like. People started looking at flies about 100 years ago. At the time, it was only men that used to do this kind of thing. Now, thankfully, we have a better gender balance. But over these 100 years, I guess, a fly has contributed very important research, including 6 Nobel Prizes, and it shed light on aspects of immunity, neurobiology, developmental biology. So we decided to use the fly to explore the brain-gut axis, and in particular, whether they might...
Irene, can you hear me?
Yeah, Irene? Sure.
Yeah, ¿Te importaría hablar un poco más despacio?
And would you mind speaking a little bit more slowly, because I take it the interpreters are having a tough job. Yes, thank you. I tend to speak very quickly. Sorry about that.
So we decided to investigate whether perhaps there were some sex differences in the brain-gut axis using the fly. So you might be surprised to hear that flies have brains and also flies have guts. And if we look at the gut of a fly, it's really not that different from ours. So we find the same cell types that we would find in a gastrointestinal tract. So we find stem cells. So these are the cells that replenish the intestinal epithelium that constantly regenerated. And we also find the nerve cells that I was alluding to that control the gastrointestinal tract. And flies have really complex behavior and physiology like us. So they kind of eat the kind of things that we eat, but a few days later. So they like to feed on rotten food, but they have a very diverse sort of kind of foods that they choose to eat from. And they make really complex food choices. So if they're lacking a certain nutrient, they will seek that particular nutrient. They can also get fat, and they can also get diabetic. They have insulin, and they have the kind of hormones that we're familiar with from us. So for the past probably 7 or 8 years now, we've been looking at whether the gastrointestinal tract is different between males and females. And we've been really surprised to find that there are sex differences everywhere we look at. So I'm not really going to go into much detail about the science today, but basically what we found is that all cell types in the fly gut know their sex. So we've been looking in the stem cells. So these are the cells that replenish the damaged cells of the gut, and they are different between the sexes. We've been looking also at the so-called enterocytes. So these are the cells that help with the digestion and with the absorption of nutrients, and they too are different between the sexes. And finally, we've been looking at the nerve cells. So the nerve cells that live on our gut, and they are also different between the sexes. So I think collectively, from all the work that we've done, we've learned 3 things. So 3 things that we feel are important and probably relevant beyond flies. So what we found is that the ways in which a cell knows its sex, so the ways in which a cell finds out whether it's male or female, are different and depends on the cell. So some cells, for example, become aware that they're male or female because of kind of intrinsically, because of their sex chromosomes. So we've already heard a little bit about this from Sabine's talk. So in their chromosomes, they know whether they're, for example, they're XX or XY, and this will matter for whether they're male or female. But some of these other cells become male or female because of hormones. So we've heard from Raül and also from Sabine that you can be exposed to male hormones or female hormones, and you will become male or female as a result of this. But in all cases, what we're finding is that these cues that make cells male or female are actively maintained in adults, right? So they need to constantly be told whether they're male or female, and therefore we can reverse the sexual fate of these cells. We can make them female when they were male, and we can make them male when they were female, and we can do it even in adult flies, even in flies that have already developed as males or as females. The other thing that we're finding is that all of these mechanisms that we're identifying, they control different features of these sex difference. So there are different features, and the features are, does this cell divide more often? Does this cell handle metabolism in a different way? And all these aspects are controlled by different mechanisms of this sexually dimorphic fate. But collectively, I think, and that's something that we've been surprised to find, is that all these sex differences seem to contribute to reproduction. So in other words, that the sex of the gut is important, not just for the gut, but also to maintain reproductive output. So an intestine needs to be female for the female to reproduce well, and an intestine needs to be male for the male to reproduce well. So that was a little bit unexpected to us. So I won't really go into the science. I'll just show you a couple of examples of the kind of experiments that we're doing. So I told you about stem cells. And what we found with the stem cells, so these cells that replenish the gut, is that the female ones divide more often. And actually we can transform this ability, right? So these are, in green, you're seeing these stem cells. So in males, you see fewer stem cells. In females, you see more. And we can masculinize them or feminize them genetically. So we can turn a male, so we can make a male stem cells divide more if we feminize them, or we can take a female fly and masculinize the stem cells and get them to divide less if we masculinize them. And this is both a good thing and a bad thing. So it's a good thing in the way that the female stem cells need to be female to allow the gastrointestinal tract to grow during reproduction. So as I was saying, if the female gut is female, it can grow during reproduction, it can extract more nutrients,
and that helps with the developing progeny, right, with the babies of the fly. So it sustains fecundity. And in males, again, we have a completely different mechanism and a completely different sexual sex difference, if you like, and this is to do with metabolism. And again, the mechanism is different from that of females. So in this case, what we found is that the testes of the males talk to the gastrointestinal tract. The testes kind of tell the gastrointestinal tract that the gastrointestinal tract needs to be male. And this is important because then the gastrointestinal tract produces metabolites that the testes need to make sperm. So there is this bidirectional talk, whereas the testes instructs the gastrointestinal tract to produce a certain metabolite. In this case, it's citrate. And this metabolite is taken up by the male gonad, by the testes, and it's used for spermatogenesis. And finally, even the nerve cells that live in the gut are also different between the sexes. And they don't look different. So as Raul was saying, anatomically in this case, they're really indistinguishable. So you look at a female nerve cell and a male nerve cell are exactly the same, but they function differently. And in fact, there's a subset of nerve cells that we find that they're only active in females and during reproduction. So they're normally silent, or they're not particularly active in males, and they're not particularly active in females before reproduction. But then after reproduction in females, now we're looking at the activity of these neurons. So the more the more neurons here you see, it means the more active. In mated females, these neurons become more active. And again, this is important to sustain reproduction. And in this case, what we found is that in response to reproductive hormones, these neurons become active. And this activity is required for females to increase food intake only during reproduction. So any of you who have been pregnant will have felt that we're a lot more hungry during pregnancy and lactation. And that is also true in flies. And the reason why they are is because of the nerve cells in the gut and because of the changes in the activity of these cells. So by now you may be wondering, well, this is all very well, but this lady's just telling us about fruit fly. Surely this is not very relevant to us humans. So some of the work that we've been doing has been exploring whether these sex differences also apply to other organisms, including humans. So you already heard about mice from Raul, and we've been looking at the gastrointestinal tract of mice. And again, we're finding exactly the same as we're finding in flies. So the male and the female gut are very different. Here we're looking at the genes that they express. We find that the genes that they express are very different. And they're particularly different during reproduction in females. So when the female is pregnant or when the female is lactating, it becomes incredibly different from males. And the gut, again, grows pretty dramatically during pregnancy and lactation also in females. And we're also beginning to look at the gastrointestinal tract of humans directly, because as I was saying, nobody has looked at this before. And again, we are finding that even anatomically, the male and the female guts are different. So we're now trying to devise methods to also quantify or measure functional features of our own digestive tract and see how they differ between males and females. So I just want to end with two considerations, with two things that often I discuss with people when I present this work. I remember presenting this a few years ago, and somebody, a male in the audience, was very upset that I was suggesting that the female gut was better than the male gut, because I was saying it proliferated more, right? The cells divided more often, and that allowed the gut to grow. And I think when we consider these things, there's no better and there's no worse. We really need to consider what we refer of as trade-offs. So in the case of these stem cells, for example, the female gut is more adaptable in the sense that it can allow the gut to grow when it's needed during reproduction. But for example, we've also seen that this tendency to divide more often renders the female gut more vulnerable to tumors, to tumorigenic insults. So this is just one example. If we trigger tumorigenesis with an oncogene, you see that there's a massive expansion of proliferation of these dividing cells in the female gut, whereas that's not the case in the male gut. And if we masculinize the stem cells of a female, now we can prevent this tumor formation. So in some ways, it's good to have cells that proliferate a lot, that divide a lot to replenish the gut when it's needed, but it's also bad in the context of, for example, tumors. So I think this notion of trade-offs is very, very important. And I guess I just want to summarize, everything I presented in the context of this meeting. I think what's really worth considering is that really many, if not most of features of how organs work and decline are at some level different between the sexes. And I think what we're learning mechanistically is that organs know their sex in different ways. And what I mean by that is that they know it intrinsically. The cells know their sex through their own genes, but also because of the hormones that they listen to. And finally, I think it is really important to not just to describe, but also to mechanistically understand these sex differences, not just from a sort of discovery science perspective, because, but I think also they are predictive of both disease susceptibility and responses to treatment. And I think that's all I have time to tell you about. So thank you. These are the people in my lab that contributed to some of the work that I presented today, especially Bruno and Daphne. These are all our collaborators and also our funders. And thank you for your attention.
Gracias, Irene.
Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Irene.
Ahora tenemos algunos minutos.
So now we have spare minutes in case you have any questions for Raúl, Irene, Mathias, Sabine. Still connected online. We have close to 90 people joining us from elsewhere online. So any questions for Raúl? Don't be shy. So I'll start, Raúl. Well, what do you think if after seeing your presentation, what I found most surprising is that in those staging of the research process, there is no scientific excellence at the beginning. How does it play out? How do we try that this is done right from the beginning so that the results are excellent? Well, I fully agree with you, and what is most concerning, and even though from the European Union it is told that there are more things affecting women than men, and the EU is funding studies justifying sex, but when funding reaches researchers, and if you look at the science, nature, and other aspects, well, most studies don't use females. So if you ask, of course, the answer will be yes. But funding explains that we should also use gender. But what you see is that basically the studies which are published are basically male-related because the journals don't require that. And then, well, there's a bit of a problem there that we need to solve. I don't know if you have further questions. Let me check if there are any online questions. Thank you. So now, after this highly technical and biomedical section, I must say that we can maybe start with the one related to social sciences. We have two brilliant speakers in economy and law. So if Paula Rodríguez, if you are there, We will connect with her now. She's a professor of economics at the University Pablo de Olavide and specialist for UN women on macroeconomic policies. She's currently leading 2 research projects on gender inequalities in the 4th industrial revolution and work-life balance in the digital age, funded by the Ministry of Science and Innovation at the Centra Foundation. She is an evaluator of the European Horizon EEA grants and coast action calls related to gender equality. So welcome, Paula.
Buenos días. ¿Me escucháis bien?
Perfecto.
Vale. Pues si os parece voy a compartir una presentación. Un momento.
No se ve por ahora, Paula.
Sí, no se ve.
Please bear with me while I try to share my presentation.
¿La veis ahora?
Ahora.
Bueno. La pongo en pantalla completa. Bueno, voy a tratar de hablar hoy brevemente sobre cómo podemos incorporar la dimensión.
I will try to speak about gender mainstreaming in economics research. Firstly, we should know that we should integrate the gender dimension not as an individual attribute, but rather as a construct of socio-economic structures. And when we talk about this, well, we're talking about the analysis of the gender relations and their evolution. This is not an individual attribute of a person. And this makes the analysis more complicated, and that's why we find research which do not include this dimension. And there is inequality in distribution when we talk about resources, money, incomes between men and women, by age, ethnicity, race. And this implied a lower autonomy for women, but also we should integrate the gender dimension in as far as a relational inequality. Women are subordinate in a power structure, in society, and in the building of our economy. And this is because women, due to their sex, they have children and they have been attributed the caregiver role, thus placing them in an inferior position as this work is not paid, not even socially acknowledged. And this has a huge impact on the economy design and on the economy analysis. Therefore, if you want to design optimal policies, we need to include the gender dimension or the gender perspective. Otherwise, the results will be wrong and biased, as we will be ignoring all the unpaid caregiving work sustaining our societies, and also ignoring one of the main power relations in our society. So it is of the essence to include this. So why is it so difficult? And why do we find so many analyses not including this? Because the apparatus doing the analysis doesn't incorporate it. it totally ignores care and focuses on the marginalist school in order to analyze how we maximize individual well-being in terms of leisure and benefits. It doesn't include the unpaid work done by men and women. It's all about the supposedly neutral agents choosing, although the experience of a certain men taken as a reference, and therefore they don't do care work. And then is not taking into consideration the option of doing a work that is unpaid. So that is why that from the business sector, we hear that workers need to work longer, and that in Spain we work little. And this is because it is considered that people only choose how to use our time for either leisure or paid work, without considering that there is a great deal of time going into unpaid care work. So this is the definition used by many economic analysts, and this is a very restrictive definition for economic analysis. It is a conventional one, excluding everything that is unpaid care, and therefore is making invisible all these work mainly done by women. And this is the case, even though that even for many years, the ILO changed the definition of work. So for the ILO, the work is human activities which are paid or unpaid, producing goods and services for an economy, or fulfilling the needs of a community, or providing the livelihood for the individual. So for many years you see that the ILO itself doesn't equate employment and work. So employment is a part of work, is a fraction of work. In spite of all of this, well, there are still general analysis equating employment and work, thus ignoring the unpaid care work. And this has a huge impact in the whole economic analysis. So we are ignoring that this unpaid work and unmeasured work is actually propping up the economy in a way. So when we are measuring the productivity, we are measuring a false productivity. Because we're talking about GDP divided by the workforce. So if the GDP is, we are not including all goods and services, well, and then we are not included in the workforce all the people doing a job. We are removing everyone doing unpaid care work. So even our benchmark for productivity is wrong, and this is in a way, this work is in a way propping up our economy. This sexual view of work where women mostly work in the unpaid care work, because still today women do 70% of unpaid work. Well, it means that at the end of the day, women have a subordinate position with less negotiating power, as at the end of the day, they are doing unrecognized work. So if you are willing to spend many hours of your time to something that is not paid, then you'll have less negotiating power in the market. And therefore, we are limiting the workforce supply for women. There is a bag, a reservoir of cheap workforce, female workforce, that the market will integrate when it needs it. For example, there is a world war, or with a shortcoming, or there's a lack of female workforce. And when they are not needed anymore, they are expelled out of the job market. So it's nice to have a cheap workforce for when you need it. So this means that they have a lower position in the job market. So there will still be a salary gap in the job market. We know these women are working, well, doing unpaid work, and then if you know that you can pay them less. So at the end of the day, the sexual view of work is the main reason for the salary gap in the market. So you see that women are increasing social well-being detrimentally to their own well-being. In their economic analysis, where workers need to choose between leisure and work for money, well, it is women who need to choose between care work, paid work, and leisure. Therefore, they are limiting their individual well-being. So, what does this entail? Well, that we can't design economic policies without integrating all these inequalities between men and women, especially when it comes to relations, to power relations. So all social policies, care policies, fiscal policies, tax policies will affect not only the job supply, but also the demand for women. So if the kindergarten, if the caregiving services, university services are better or worse, that will affect the job and supply, or rather the supply and demand for female jobs. So when we analyze this market, we need to also analyze the supply of services in the care work sector. And we need to analyze whether we're talking about care for minors, as this is affecting supply and demand for female jobs, and also the tax consolidation policies or public expenditure reduction policies. These will also affect differently men than women. For example, depending on how we apply them, well, they will affect more women, as these public services, they take away jobs from women. And we're talking about care work. And also, women are the ones with the lowest income due to the salary gap. They are poorer, and then they are in a regressive, if the position is regressive, this will harm more women than men. And also the banking policies, and we need to integrate the gender dimension. If women's access to credits is limited and the starting point position is worse, then they will be more affected by restriction in their access to banking credit. And then the trade policies, affecting what, where, how it is produced, and how it is outsourced. How this production is outsourced in countries where most workers are low-paid women, and also migration policies. We know women contribute with a higher share of income for the remittance that they send to their origin countries, even though migrant women have lower wages than male workers, but they contribute with a higher percentage for their remittances. And in times of crisis, we see that their remittances are more stable, as their jobs are more stable. In the last big crisis we suffered, that was one from 2008 to 2014, the remittances from women were more stable than those issued by men, as many lost their jobs as they were working in masculinized sectors and with a huge loss of jobs. And these are some just examples, and all these inequalities affect the whole economic systems and therefore all the economic policies. So how is the gender dimension integrated in the economic research? Well, as in any other research area, in the first stage, we need to analyze how the gender perspective was introduced in the research area and then integrate the gender approach in all hypotheses. We know impact will be different whether we're talking about men or women, so we need to question which are the impacts based on the position of men and women, which we know is different in all societies. So we need to question all these research hypotheses and starting points from a gender perspective. Also, we need to see whether we introduce the gender approach as a way to stratify people. We also analyze all social processes, and we analyze how sex interacts with ethnicity and other aspects, and then we also see discrimination by gender. And then, when designing these data collection instruments, we are including the identification of gender differences, and in our methodology design, we are using samples, integrating, having enough people so that we have a significant sample so that we see all inequalities by gender, but also cross-comparing it with other variables. So that we can clearly explain the gender differences and the gender relations, and then lastly, communications. We need to be cautious when, in order to present all gender differences, and the gender perspective needs to be included, and also the recommendations should be included. For example, if a man knows about the position of women in society and in economy, and they recognize the inequalities, well, then it's quite easy to see the differentiated impacts between men and women from the economic perspective. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paula. It's a pleasure to listen to you, also to listen, to hear about research on scientific, on rather economic research, affecting also the R&D&I system in Navarra, affecting all sectors, not only the economy. So thank you for participating. So now we move on to the next speaker. Just to let you know that after Fernando Lousada's intervention, we will recess. Please use the back door if you like to have a coffee. But before that, let me tell you that Fernando Lousada, whom you might know, he's a social magistrate in the Social Chamber of the High Court of Justice of Galicia. He holds a PhD in law with extraordinary prize from the University of Coruña with his thesis, The Fundamental Right to Effective Equality of Women and Men. He's a researcher and author of countless books. So, Fernando, I don't know if you are ready.
Please go ahead.
Buenos días a todas y a todos. Bueno, mis primeras palabras desde luego tienen que ser de agradecimiento doble, bueno, pues a la organización, a Marusha, por haber contado conmigo.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Marusha, for the kind introduction and for inviting me to talk about the gender dimension and how we introduce it in the legal perspective, and also for making it possible to meet online. Well, I couldn't be there in Navarre, but I've been there to your lovely region previously, and I hope I can do this again in the future. That said, I'd like to talk about the gender perspective in law and how we apply law to teaching and legal research. So let me start by saying something that you might have heard yesterday by Ana de Miguel on philosophy, and so Paula Rodríguez on economy, and then the same applies to law. Women have been excluded from the world of law throughout history, and that is why feminism has always been very critical with law from the origins in their pursuit of equality. So it doesn't come as a surprise, this criticism of there is a exclusion as a starting point from the very old ancient times, from the Greek times, Roman times, and this has been perpetuated throughout history, really. And also some of the, during the first year of the law studies, the Romans, as we explained, they justified the difference due to three main reasons, as these are prejudices that still exist today. First, they spoke the lively reasoning of women and the ignorance of women. And these were some of the reasons they used to exclude and justify the limitation of rights that women had to endure. And the last one, ignorance of things, of the forum, basically that they don't know about politics, about law, about life in society. That's what they actually meant. Well, basically they couldn't speak in public, women couldn't, and therefore they were excluded of the world of politics, the world of law, and it has been mentioned in Homer's Odyssey. The first scene is Penelope coming down from her rooms, and then Telemachus, those intending to marry her, the suitors, were gathering around, and Telemachus said, "Go back to your rooms, ma'am." And there was these these fabric, and said, "Go back to your rooms and then leave this on the hand of men." So basically she was excluded from politics and law. And I am aware that some female lawmakers were there, but they've been marginal. So I'm talking about Rome, the Middle Ages, the legal specialists of the modern age, and also the legal specialists in the recent years have been mostly men, with just a few exceptions. We had queens in Spain in the Middle Ages, and we know Isabel la Católica. But they were forced to act as queens with the assessment of a male council around them. And now, fast forwarding, two decisions from the US Supreme Court from the 19th century. One about Mira Pratwell seeking to be able to work as a lawyer in her state. And the Supreme Court said, no, this was down to the states to decide. And they argued that this was the prohibition of the lawyering practice of women was against the natural design of women, and the utmost purpose of women was to fulfill her purpose as wife and mother. And that is what the Supreme Court ruled in 1772. So how come they could have said that if under the US Constitution we've seen on many films they start by saying that we consider that all men were created equal? How could they say that? And at the end of the day, what's underlying this denial of this right is ignorance again, or this prejudice of the ignorance of the things of the forum that we've mentioned before. And also the Supreme Court denied the right to vote, and the court said that suffrage was a very important responsibility. So it would seem that suffrage is not just for anyone, especially women, as they ignore things. So in Europe, well, things were the same. The declarations of men and citizens were obviously about men, and also in the Bush basically translated the Declaration of the Rights of Men and Citizens and turned it into the Declaration of Women and Female Citizens. And, well, it is well known that she suffered the guillotine for that reason. So the question is why? Why was equality proclaimed in the French and American revolutions, and nevertheless there was no equality for women? Because equality was just for men, only for men. Only men were created under the US Constitution, and the declaration of the French Declaration is for men and citizens. And this was justified on the grounds of a limited understanding of the equality laws. Law had to be equal for everyone, applied also equally, but then the law itself could introduce inequalities. If this was introduced by the legislative power, there was no problem. Nobody would question that nobody was above the law, but there was inequality in the content of the law. And that is how all inequalities were justified. And we're talking about legal inequalities between men and women, especially when the court said that the vote was only for men. They understand that human beings were only men, not women. So that's why we talk about non-sexist language, sometimes paving the way for jokes, but is more transcendent and more important than we might think. Also, from the historical perspective, the use of the masculine noun as a plural as a collective noun, has meant the exclusion of women in many areas. And there is another underlying reason, is that when we deep dive to see what was the grounds for inequality, and that we see that there are prejudices coming from Roman law and expressing themselves throughout all illustrated thinkers of the 18th century, throughout philosophy. Well, yesterday Ana de Miguel explained this very well, but we can remember what Rousseau said or explained about Sophia's education on chapter number 5 of his book, which was all about submission to her man, to her man. Same with Kant, Hegel, with all the so-called thinkers of the rule of law as we know it today and where we live in today. So just, well, regarding feminism, the first few waves in the 19th century, some highlight this idea of rationality from illustration, but applied to women. And we know Mary Wollstonecraft and her statement, who said that Rousseau, when he spoke about Sophia's education, was actually an erotic fantasy rather than rationality. And that was applicable to Rousseau and all other thinkers. And then Melia Barcalcer explained that feminism is the unwanted child or the bastard child of illustration. They applied rationality, but well, the illustration itself wasn't applying rationality with women. Feminism is a rational movement, and on that basis, well, it has evolved first, seeking equality of rights for men and women, equality under the law. Remember, the law could establish distinctions as long as it was done in a general way, and sex was one of these such generalities. But equality wasn't contemplated in the content of the law, and also the feminism in the 19th century around the suffragette movement and the prostitution abolitionist movement, which were maybe the two main movements of feminism in the 19th century. They were seeking equality, the right to vote, the right to education, the right to a job. However, as this was conquered in Spain, I remember that women, well, there was... Well, yesterday we talked about this woman who had to access university disguised as a man to be able to enter the building. And then, I think, until 1911 or 1912, in order to access university, well, first, women were prohibited from doing so. But back in the day, an authorization was requested from the education ministry, so women couldn't just freely attend any lectures and register for university. Well, things were achieved, new landmarks, voting rights, and the formal equality under the law was achieved. But the problem is that, and when talking about the French Revolution, I've already mentioned it, this is a concept that is very limited when we talk about equality. It doesn't deal with the bottom of the issue, which is the prejudices. So to provide you with some context. In voting, yes, the right to vote was achieved, but did this change this prejudice that women are ignorant of the things of the forum? Does this change that? And my answer is no. It's still there. So, equal voting rights, well, is what I usually call as a classical equality law. It's only things of sex, not so much other aspects, and it focuses on just voting. We need to see whether there's a difference between men and women, and when we distinguish the difference, when men would vote, women couldn't, we need to analyze whether that difference is rational or is irrational. And remember the debate that was ongoing during the Second Republic to see whether women were allowed to vote. If this is not rational, well, it's important to see is that this classical law doesn't deal with the bottom of the issue, which is the prejudices which manifest themselves in other way. And you might ask how. And, well,
how is prejudice expressed? Well, you allow women to vote, but for them to be little voted, for them not to hold relevant positions, and suppose efforts have been made to make up for that with other measures. But we also have that traditional interest, little interest or poor interest by political parties, though things are improving actually. But let's remember, political parties and their programs and campaigns and how they address this issue in a very tangential manner, even today, too, instead of considering this matter in a cross-cutting way in all their program, throughout their programs. And at present, we can also see it in the different assessment of what female policymakers or politicians do versus male policymakers. We can see that in, hatred crimes being committed or intended for women in the public sphere to a greater extent, or female politicians. The scarce representation of women in those positions or their presence in political programs, or another circumstance, well, what I just mentioned, the hatred discourse based on gender, all that brings back to the table that voting rights were, of course, a huge achievement at the time, essential for what happened afterwards, but it did not allow us to put an end to inequality and discrimination and equal opportunities. And this has caused for a radical change in the very concept. In fact, if we go back to the French Revolution, they talked about the application of the law on an equal basis, but it is not enough if we consider what I just explained. We need to take a step ahead and find why and determine why, this subject is still en vogue. The existence of inequalities in treatment, in physics, philosophy, urban planning, economics, sociology. What we see here in this type of meeting is not by chance, is not a coincidence. It is due to a course which feminism, as from elaborations by Simone de Beauvoir and other authors, then supported by the whole feminist movement in the US first and then in Western Europe, have come to a point in which the cause for inequality is down to the gender. Or as Paula said a minute ago, gender as an abstract construct, as social and cultural stereotypes associated to people's sex, and that gender pervades all legal laws and standards and operations, from the passing of a law, the application of a law or an act, and its interpretation, its constructs. All this bias infiltrates it all. How can we put an end to that? Well, if I had the answer, I would have done it already. But if we talk about discrimination, which is not an odd thing, but systemic, then the solution to that needs to be systemic too. And this has been addressed by the seminar too. In the world of law, this is known as the transversality principle in equal treatment and equal opportunities. This cross-cutting principle needs to turn laws and acts in acts that deactivate the bias and prejudice instantly, and those existing in society. That's why equality or classic equality laws just say both men and women are equal as regards voting rights, education rights, etc. But modern equality acts, most of them are cross-cutting: the Spanish Act, the Domestic Violence Act in Spain, and all the regional acts that have been passed depart from the fact that that does not suffice. It needs to be applied throughout the aspects of legal life. And this is not at all an easy job. It needs to be applied at two main levels. On the one hand, in the application of the rule, and on the other hand, in the study and research of that rule or norm or law. How do you do that? Not easy. We are all familiar with criminal proceedings, such as the Spanish case La Manada, gang raping lawsuit in Spain, well known in Spain. But I suppose there are many cases. I remember one 15 years ago in Italy's higher court, a woman wearing jeans, saying, the court said that with jeans she couldn't be raped because jeans are very tight, and then she would have resisted the attack. She wouldn't have been raped. It's not possible to rape a woman in jeans, wearing jeans. Or the Portuguese Supreme Court with a similar ruling in other fields. There was a woman asking for medical compensation. She had had an operation, a surgery, that caused her not to be able to feel sexual pleasure. The ruling said, well, this woman is in her 50s, and it's not that important for her to enjoy sex or to have children. So it wasn't that important a blow for her, and so the court reduced the compensation sum. So I always say these two things. Basically, the judiciary, the judges try to do a good job. And of course, there are many decisions, many rulings that don't make that type of mistakes. But I can also say that these prejudices and these bias impregnates the whole of society. And following the Council of Europe and United Nations recommendations and progress, we can refer to three measures: training, more training, and a lot more training. In other words, the gender dimension needs to be known by judges and all parties and stakeholders in law. In those who study law, they need to be trained, they need to be educated, they need to have that knowledge. In that regard, I think the judiciary and the judicial power are doing a relatively good job. I'm one of the directors of a training program which has delivered training to more than 1,500 judges in Spain. And this idea of mine, yesterday Thomas Braga mentioned it in his talk, the God trick. Remember? The God trick. We study law, the legal degree, the law degree, and right from year one in the undergraduate degree, we are told that law is the logic, law is the reason prevailing, you know, so that law is free from religion, so that law is free from other things. You know, for law to be law only and reason only. That's the very essence of the Enlightenment, to build a state based on logic, based on reason, although, as we saw before, they forgot half of the population of the world. But anyway, we are told that when we go to university and we do our law degree, we are taught that law is synonymous with logic and reason. But then, if you're being taught that throughout your degree, then, you know, no mention whatsoever is made to the gender perspective. That being my case, though obviously I'm an older person. But even today, you know, nowadays, the gender dimension is not included in the courses delivered at law school. And in some of those courses, in some of the subjects, it should be a core teaching. And so this absence, when we finish our degrees, we sort of think we have the notion of reason there in our heads, and that is the God trick. Anything related to that, anything that comes from that basis, from that premise, is perverted because it is not in line with the concept of reason we were taught. So after the degree, obviously, if you have a training course about gender, or, you know, as a judge, as a solicitor, as a lawyer, you know, these courses being delivered by judges' associations is helpful. It is helpful indeed, but there's a mistake there in education, in higher education, in the degree, because, you know, I suppose if you are teaching constitutional law in university, I suppose you will have to teach something about gender and the gender dimension. And as Paula Rodríguez said, the right to a job is built on the prejudice that that right does not cover all of the work. Let me explain. Just that work that is deemed to be productive by society. And so, as Ana de Miguel said yesterday when she talked about Adam Smith and the butcher, and Adam Smith's mom, remember, making dinner for him? Well, that type of work is not included, is it? Is overlooked. So if we are not told all these things when we are doing our university degree, if that dimension is not included, then the idea that law, the way it stands, is what applies, and that way of standing is being end-of-centric, then that is the logic. That makes the logic and reason, as I mentioned earlier. And I'm sure you are all familiar, you know, with people saying all these fashions and these trends with feminism, you know, they want to come and teach us about gender now. But we do know what gender means because we know what logic and reason is all about. We were taught in university. Without a doubt, unless we start dismantling, putting apart all these things right from university in the undergraduate degree and, you know, throughout people's career, of course, later it is a lot more difficult. Hence, the importance of the gender dimension in education, in research, and of course, the relevance of this type of seminar, this meeting today, for which I'm so very thankful. Thank you very much for your invitation. And thank you for organizing, you know, similar meetings. I hope there will be plenty of them in the future. Thank you. Thank you, Fernando. So happy, so pleased for you to have included, you know, the legal dimension and how much it affects us, you know, because we talk a lot about engineering, about health sciences, but everything is important, of course. So your gaze, your presentation is absolutely necessary. Thank you. Thank you ever so much. So let's continue now, and let's move on to Roger Sora. Roger is the main researcher in the Interdisciplinary Studies Department for Culture in NTNU in Norway. He has a PhD in Science and Technology Studies. He works in projects like Life Bots in neuroscience and the project Rurales for sustainable agriculture. Sora has published many papers and books on automation, robotics, digitization, technological prognosis, and social change. Roger, you have the floor.
The floor is yours. Thank you. We don't hear you, Roger.
I'm so sorry. How about now?
Perfect.
Okay. Let me just turn off my... Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference on gender dimensions in research. I'm very honored to be here, and I will talk to you today about incorporating gender perspectives in research. So the big question that I am investigating is how are gender perspectives incorporated in research and innovation? In this case, robotics and artificial intelligence, which is my area of study. And this is part of work I have done for the Gendered Innovations 2 expert group for Horizon Europe, which will form some of the examples I'll show you here today. So let us take a small step back before we get down to the technology and look at us humans. Because we humans, we are quite great, but we can also discriminate and exclude. And the danger is if technology can reproduce these discriminatory actions and exclusive mechanisms. For humans, we find, for example, homophobia. We find unequal opportunities. Human societies are also have quite some misogyny. There are ageism, whether you are too young or too old. There is nationality and racial bias, and also socioeconomic discrimination that is done towards and between humans and societies. And the big issue when we are implementing technological systems is if technology will pick up on some of these biases and reproduce them, or even create new forms of biases that we don't know about from before. So let us first take a look at artificial intelligence, or AI, and how AI understands the world. So a computer program is quite binary in its source. It is either ones or zeros that are put together to form an understanding of the world. And when computer programs are trying to understand human societies, they often need to categorize things. For example, if you Google pictures of male hobbies, you will get pictures like this on the right, lots of games, lots of technology, and things that the computer systems and Google's search algorithms connect with male hobbies. While if you Google female hobbies, you will get pictures such as the image on the left, like baking and painting and gardening. So this is how a computer would try to code the world into these two different categories. But let us also take a look at what artificial intelligence is, which is a step up from just a normal computer program. So the dictionaries define artificial intelligence as an area of computer science that deals with giving machines the ability to seem like they have human intelligence. So the keyword here is seem to, and also the power of a machine to copy intelligent human behavior. So the keyword here is copy. And here they give an example, a robot with artificial intelligence. And I'm going to come back to robots as embodied AI later in the presentation. But artificial intelligence is actually a term that is quite contested, for example, by Kate Crawford in her book, Atlas of AI, that just came out this year, where she argues that AI is neither artificial nor intelligent. Her argument that it is not artificial is because AI consists of hardware made from materials extracted from the earth. AI involves human workers in all stages of building AI. And also software is coded by humans that are not bias-free, but also reproduce human environments and social structures. This is what Nelly Utzorn in 2004, for example, calls the configuring the user, or the I methodology, where a computer programmer would think of often himself first and think that the world needs what I need. So the I methodology, to see the user as just a reflection of yourself. Further, Crawford argues that AI is not very intelligent if we measure it against humans. In the AI community, we often distinguish between what is called narrow or weak AI, which is easy or simple tasks done in intelligent manners, like, for example, playing chess. But if you take a chess playing AI to, for example, do gardening, it will not be able to do that because it is made for a very narrow task, like playing chess. Then we have the other type of AI called general or strong AI, which is human-like general capability, which is an AI that would function as a human would. But this is still not realized. We don't know if it will ever be the case that we will have general or strong AI. And as of now, it is the stuff of science fiction. And now I want to show you some different types of AI biases for worker recruitment as something I have studied quite a lot recently. In 2015, Amazon's AI recruiting system showed bias against women. It used historical data from the last 10 years to train their AI model to hire new employees in Amazon. And here it used the quite well-known male dominance across the tech industry. There were mostly men hired in this type of industry. And then the AI learned that recruiting male candidates were preferable to women because males had been recruited previously, and tagged certain words as women's chess club captain as an unwanted criteria, since there were very few people working there that had been women's chess club captains, even though we might, of course, see with our human intelligence that it's quite a nice attribute to have been a club captain of chess. And this also reflects the general tech industry's focus on historically hiring males and a certain lack of female employment. So this shows some of the dangers that can be reproduced when you do as you have always done. Another example is from 2019, where Facebook had an option where you can target ads to sort and show ads by gender, race, religion, and age, for example. And there it was shown that women were shown job adverts primarily for nursing or secretarial work, while men were shown job ads for example, janitors and taxi drivers. And in particular, men from minority backgrounds were shown these types of jobs, furthering reproducing the socioeconomic bias. So there are lots of examples that show AI bias for worker recruitment, but once these are shown, they are often dealt with. So these types of AI biases are no longer being used. Another issue with AI is the facial recognition problems that have been focused on quite a lot recently, because we have seen that for large companies, they often prefer to train systems on white male faces, and dark female faces are not that much prioritized. For example, in a study called Gender Shades, which looked at how the big tech companies are working when they are identifying different faces, they found that 100% of lighter males had their face correctly identified, but for darker skinned females, the number was only 68%. So you can be double discriminated on, as is known in the intersectionality theory, where you are discriminated on first by being a woman and also for being a person of color. And this is not only a racial issue, it's also an issue, for example, for trans people who are deprioritized and discriminated against, for example, at the quite binary airport controls, where you have to be coded as either male or female, and there's little flexibility to understand gender as not binary. So if we try to put gender in terms of what a computer is able to understand, we might have some issues. And now I wanted to show you some examples of embodied AI. So what happens when AI get actual bodies, as can be seen in robots. This is an example of the Japanese robot Pepper. It is a social robot, often used in service industries. And here we can see it dressed up as Little Red Riding Hood in the top left corner, and also with a butler costume, and also another costume with a dress and ponytails, which is a quite gendered way of portraying Pepper. But when we look at the website of the developer, they say that Pepper is a humanoid. But it is not a human. So here we can see that they have created a sort of third category for the robot Pepper, and saying Pepper is a robot that has no gender. But here again, we have the default option of male and female, and then we have suddenly the robot as a category. And this is quite interesting when we look at robots who are more gendered than Pepper. As I've shown in my research, the more human-like robots becomes, the more gendered they also becomes. And this can be seen in the case of the robot Sophia. So Sophia the robot is made by Hanson Robotics in 2016 and actually modeled after Audrey Hepburn, the famous actress, here seen down on the left. Sophia the robot was given a citizenship in Saudi Arabia at a time where human women couldn't drive in the country, which is quite interesting in terms of rights. But we can ask ourselves, is Sophia the robot actually a woman? Is she female? What is her actual role? And she was, by the way, featured at the ADItech Science Agurtzane event in 2018. So if you had been in the room where you are 3 years ago, you might have been able to meet her, but I don't see her there today. But if you have a chance, it's a very fascinating robot to meet and talk to. But when we try to unwrap what a mechanical gender can actually mean, I like to look at the anthropomorphization, which is to attribute human qualities to a non-human thing, to check what sort of human qualities are these robots given. And this is not only the case for very advanced robots like Sophia and Pepper, but also for robots like robot vacuum cleaners. If you have one, you often give it a name or a personality. It becomes a someone instead of just a something. We also have the case of voice assistants being quite gendered with Siri, Alexa. This is Microsoft's voice assistant, Cortana, which has been scrapped recently. It's not depicted as this anymore, but it was originally inspired by this artificial women in the Halo computer game. And just to show that it is quite connected to sexist depictions. We also see that robots have a lot of inspiration from fiction, where more advanced robots are shown to be quite gendered, as can be seen here on the picture to the right, which is from the Ex Machina movie that was released a couple of years ago. But how does the gendering of technology actually impact us users? Lastly, I want to have a look at gender in research and why we need to focus on gender and technology in research. First of all, it's very important to look at the whole female-male dichotomy. For example, the 10th of November marks the day where women in the EU work for free. Since the pay gap is about 14%, it's different between different countries, but it just shows that we have a long way to go. And when you add sexuality and gender identity into the mix, it complicates things quite a lot. For example, in a study done on Twitter's gendering of users, so Twitter works mostly due to ad revenue, so it needs to show advertisement. But the question is, what type of advertisement should it show gay men? Should it show ads for women or ads for men? How does Twitter define what is male in the first place? And does it do a straight default? In our study of this, we found that gay men were often assigned to be women. So it needed to define them into two quite binary categories again. But erasing and hiding gender is not the way to move forward, as has been quite prioritized by the Horizon Europe program for research, where I wanted to highlight 3 different things that are important to keep in mind. If you are making a research or innovation proposal there, you need a gender equality plan, which is now a criterion for certain categories of legal entities from EU countries and associated countries. You need to integrate gender dimensions into your research and innovation content. This is now a requirement and an award criterion under the excellence criterion. And you need to ensure to have good gender balance, as we see that increasing gender balance throughout the program has a target of 50% of women in Horizon Europe related boards, expert groups, and evaluation committees. So this is quite important to take into account also on a quite basic level. But the key takeaways I want you to bring with you today is to have a knowledge of technology as something that is gendered, biased, and socially situated. But of course, not all hope is lost. True awareness and approaches, we can mitigate discrimination and elevate good practices. But we need to be aware that technology is not neutral. It's always placed in a social technical context. And that is all for my presentation from today. Feel free to reach out to me on email or social media. Here are the references if you want to read more. And I look forward to taking any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Is there any questions here from the public? ¿Alguna pregunta en el público?
Any questions from the audience?
Roger, if we've actually received lots of comments saying what is this? How can you talk about gender robots? And like saying, excuse my words, this is bullshit. So what would you say to researchers when they deny that this is something important, that is something to take into consideration, Roger?
Thank you. I understood that the question was why we need to consider the gender of robots in the first place. And that is because it actually impacts society quite a lot, how we gender our technologies. So creating a robot that appears very female also reproduce something about how we understand human women in society. So it's not something that has no impact on us.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you very much. As there are no further questions, we'll move on to the next speaker, and we will have with us Meike Spitzner. She is a senior researcher at the Division of Energy, Transport and Climate Policy and scientific coordinator for gender and policy at the Wuppertal Institute of Ministry of Economics, Innovation and Digitization at the Energy of the Federal State of North Rhine-Westphalia. She is a member of the Age 2020 expert group for upgrading and expanding innovation through gender.
So, Meike, I don't know if you are there already. Are you there, Meike?
Yes, I am.
Oh, very good. I'm gonna share your presentation from here as we agreed, so bear with me.
Thank you very much.
And you let me know when you want to change the slides. Okay, yes. Whenever you want, Meike, thank you.
Thank you very much. Also for invitation and also for listening to my input. My theme is, I was invited to talk about alternatives for androcentric concepts of sustainability. And there is a lot of research in the past, and I want to fit it with actual national and European research projects findings. Please, the next. First, what is the core of definition of sustainability? There was a very well-known definition of Brundtland Commission in '87. Our SDGs also based on this first definition. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability for future generations to meet their own needs. And it's interesting to be aware or to reflect and give notice to that this core definition of the United Nations had two moments: the concept of needs and the idea of limitations. And both, more or less, is a problem that it is not noticed now when it comes to concrete sustainability policies and strategies. But we should have in mind, because these are general relevant core moments. Please, the next one. Excuse me. This was the one side. The other side is to be aware of the basics since the legal establishment of gender mainstreaming on the United Nations by the United Nations Women's Conference of '95, and then established also in European Union and on national levels and so on. And 4 moments are important for us. Supposedly general assertions can no longer claim gender neutrality unless it is empirically proven. This is burden of proof reversal. It's very important for generating data because we need gender-related data, not only sex-related one, but also it is not a question of movement, women's movement or anti-discriminatory movement, but also of a professional task. So gender, and we are aware gender bias is in place, especially there where it's not reflected. This is very important looking on, for instance, net-bound infrastructures and so-called objective or nature science recognitions for sustainability. Then second, the objective, objective scientificity and general usefulness can only be considered as given when androcentrism, in the sense of fixation on the particular of societal masculinity models, have been relativized. This also gives us chances for overcoming gender biases. Gender is nothing additive to the mainstream, but it's modification. This is a very important moment, especially in the sustainability context and especially in the context of energy, of mobility and so on, or what is climate relevant. Third, responsibility of gender responsiveness belongs to all professionals in a top-down direction. It's not struggling from the bottom. The more definition and shaping power, the higher the responsibility for establishing explicit gender neutrality and making sure the modification of mainstream categories, assumptions, and so on. And at the fourth moment of gender mainstream, all policy areas and sectors are in duty actively providing their own positive contributions to societal gender equality. This means, for instance, transport policy has to contribute positive contributions. It's not only to be delivered only neutral. Next, please. I think androcentrism is well known in this context, but it is very important in the context of real debates, political relevant, to make sure that men as women, as all genders, have no shame to name it and to address androcentrism, but to be be able to address it. Androcentrism, this is the way it is discussed in advanced sustainability projects, also from the European Commission, rationalities of a societal, economical, and political fixation on a construction of societal masculinities. Important, no real man corresponds to this construct. Claiming its particular perspective, and this is implicitly not easily recognizable for men as well as for women or other genders, as universal, objective, rational, non-emotional driven, gender neutral, as a norm, a representation of normal reality, and as common useful or of common interest. This is relevant for politics, while defining femininities as deviances or additionals. Charlotte Gilman Perkins gave us this idea at the first. Next one, please. I wanted to make more illustrative, but I will do it in the data later. What is the risk of androcentrism for the chances of achieving sustainability climate goals? It is, the first risk is improper perception and handling of a problem. the improper decontextualizations are the main problems. Inefficiency of transformative efforts. This is a future-aware of precious force. The production of gender-specific stress, alienation, and disadvantages, because men close to the dominant masculinity model tend to be less exposed to an opposite or other gender or diversity rationality and respective systems. They can move in familiar and identified ways in thinking and feeling, but women at all non-conformative genders and men and all have to deal with the rationality as well as with conditions that tend not to correspond to their situation. And we have studies that in the environmental context, a lot of people are stumbling over this. So androcentrism is very important to make a theme. There is, and in the line of strategies of sustainability, there are two moments: the pressure of alignment to unsustainability, because adaptation and alignment of all people and of policies, technical and economical systems, net-bound infrastructures, etc., to the norms of an ecologically, socially, and economically unsustainable dominant model of masculinity. And this is a dynamic, a meta-dynamic. So the strategies for sustainability also tend to be to deliver unsustainability. This is a problem. So the dynamic and meta dynamic is working also in the today's more ambitious strategies. So, and these dynamics and there are also dynamics of involuntary reductions to end of the pipe approaches. You know, maybe the debate in the very old field and thematization of this in the environmental field, hardly any chance to influence the really gender-based problem causation. For instance, producing transport needs, structure production of transport needs, where the emissions come from, or the production of energy needs. And we cannot be so fast with renewable energy systems, like the energy demand, the energy needs are growing. This is a causation principle in the environmental field, well known. In the Anglo-American context, unfortunately, it is also named polluter pays principle, but this is the contrary, because polluter are the people who, for instance, in transport, who give the emissions because the transport needs are produced before structurally. So there is a high relevance of androcentrism, and this means gender, in the sustainability context, in the environmental dimensions. Next one, please. So going back on what the Commission, the United Nations Commission for Sustainable Development focused on and remains us, and in the beginning just defined it in, it gives a focus on the interlinkages of the sustainability's four dimensions. The four dimensions are, I think, known. There is a economical, the ecological, the social, and the institutional sustainability dimension. And but the Commission also says important are the interlinkages between, and not the singular observation of them. Next one, please. Coming to a non-androcentric definition of the single sustainability dimension itself, because mostly they are interpreted in a very androcentric way. But there are works, a lot of work has been done on a non-androcentric sustainability understanding, and only give for each dimension one example. there's a big debate in the institutional perspective of the necessity of institutional prevention against feminization of environmental responsibilities. This is a hard risk. It was done in the waste management field. There's research, and also in the global economy context. Gustav Wichterich did it in the waste field. Irmgard Schulz did it, and I myself did it in the transport sector. We proved that the environmental policies are oriented to a feminization of environmental responsibilities, mostly by depoliticizing and moralizing the most important steps of environmental strategies. This also is for sustainability relevant. In the economic dimension, I think it has been mentioned before, the totally the brutal ignorance that the basic societal economy isn't sustainable organized. It's the caring economy, and we have no politics on caring economy as such. We have and economical debates on sustainability and environment are excluding the basic economy, societal economy. In the ecological perspective, we have a lot in the transport sector, very hardly only the motors are a theme, but the moment is the focus should be on societal relationships to environment, because this is a relationships question. Yes, in the social dimension, we have a lot of perspectives. Mostly they are mostly reduced on jobs and on income and on prices. And okay, next one, please. So we found a really mechanism, if we have in mind the risk of androcentrism I mentioned, then the relevance of interlinkages, and then the sustainability dimensions, we come that there are specific decontextualizations of life world context, social spatial context, caring economical context, physical embodied context. We have the separation of practices along gender lines, for example, household and other production of, and the separation of rationalities from practice. We need care economical contributions, but and it is done, but it is not reflected as an input, as a resource, as a important economy. Third, making invisible the bound, the rationalities and practice of the bound. It's made invisible, and I will come to freedom, but there is a moment that the freedom is basing on bondage and independence, and those is the basic of freedom. So if you make invisible the bound and devalue the bound, it's really a problem. And for decision making under androcentrism, I mentioned, but the most important thing, there's a selective functionalization of the separated, internalizing of benefits from reproductive caring economy, the bound, and so, and an externalizing of burdens to reproduction and to caring economy in times and so on. We see it in the national time budget studies. Next one, please. Coming from this, there are done the contrary non-androcentric approaches actually are developing, such as emancipative sufficiency policy. And this means very different strategies. What does it mean with time? Transformation in the societal relationship to time or to space or to property or to market. And also there's an androcentric debate, and the androcentric debate on it within this advanced and from gender studies also co-produced or originally developed approach. There is the fifth E in German language. There are 5 E's for sufficiency. This means freedoms basing on independency and bondages. For instance, responsibility for caring and chance of getting care distributed fairly and politically sustainable anchored. Care democracy is their perspective, and this is the emancipation E. So another, next one, please. Make it concrete what can be done with non-androcentric sustainability approaches is also non-androcentric sustainability approaches are looking for more objective knowledge on the realities, also on practical relevant data, for instance. You see on the left, as an example, the categories, the androcentric categories of the motivation to be in transport, the aims of the ways. And these categories on the left show that very important is the mobility of employment. This is also personal transport modes, yes? Employment. But you see all the care economical mobility is hidden in androcentric categories like personal aims, shopping, errand, health, and so on. And on the right, you see a reconceptualization where you show care economical mobility as itself, as such, and you see the nearly same importance comes to care economical mobility. This was this theoretical and empirical concept I was able to deliver in '95, and Inés Sánchez de Madariaga and Zucchini, they did it with actual dates from 2014 and publishing this in 2019, very worthwhile. Next one, please. Also, there's developed a very important tool for different fields in the environmental and sustainability context, the gender impact assessment, which makes possible concrete analysis and political action derivations, which is very important to support the implementation in practice on different levels. And it's a problem-oriented approach. The gender impact assessment has 7 gender dimensions covering the essential societal levels of drivers of inequality and hierarchization of societal gender plus relations. So this will address the dynamic, the meta level, the drivers. So it is systematically recording and assessing progress in delivering the required positive and active intersectional gender equality impacts by the respective sector. And this makes possible understanding of acceptability because of climate policy. For instance, because we are in times where we have conflicts, where the priorities are not easy, and it will make problems as well of acceptability, but also, no, it will make problems of acceptance because of missing acceptability. Next one, please. I cannot explain the whole instrument. This is the gender impact assessment, which we which was applied, for instance, for the core national climate strategies for the German government, for the Federal Environmental Agency. and we just do it in an actual European Commission's project for worldwide for the NDCs, the national determined contributions to climate policy, and the national strategies for the sectors, energy, transport, and so on. And this is really a helpful instrument because of the moments I showed. Next one, please. There are also approaches like developed with these non-androcentric perspectives, and this is possible. For instance, the innovative energy policy approaches and instruments. So there are, it's important energy independency related social policies, for instance, because we have energy poverty more and more, and also with CO2 pricing, which is an actual strategy of European Commission, the problems will grow. The households' internal infrastructure systemic conditions. There are debates in the technical impact debates, and these also is a theme of environmental and sustainability strategies, which was ignored before for a long time and not reasonable. A longer debate and also some success is made in care economy rational and adequate public infrastructure systems, qualities and responsiveness. But this will be a very important future theme in the nearer future when when we have limits of public money and struggle about the priorities. Sufficiency I mentioned. There are new fields developed, eco-social time policies, for instance. Italian local time policy legislation was a very advanced approach. They started 15 years ago with this, and this means capacities of infrastructure can be used much more effective in a climate and in a societal perspective. Yes, but what we are missing totally, but it has been there in the debate, in the political mainstream debate in the 90s, but is missed now today, mainly totally, policies addressing the driving forces of generating energy necessities and dependencies. And this is what in the transport sector, which is very important for climate, for sustainability, for environmental, and in the energy sector, hardcore questions. And maybe there's a chance to take these approaches in reality in near future. I suppose it will come. Next one, please. Yes, and there are special, we did a big project over 3 years for the Federal Environmental Agency. What are the options for gender rebalancing climate policy, making it more successful? And these are the main findings, or the core findings, making a theme of the driving forces of climate change, and address androcentrism to have a chance to get really a transformation that gives us a chance for sustainability. Yes, and addressing the structural production of transport needs, and the decoupling of individual car transport could be modernism. Or could be the acceptable transport system as a core system. Yes, I'm very short because I think I have not as much time. Okay. Stop tabooing. The essential mitigation policy is one of the core themes, because all the aims, climate aims, are not reachable without it. And instruments for climate sector policies, sectors, private households and transport, there's always a mix that the household's production is taken as individual behavior or consumption. And to separate the household's production, the whole care economy, as an economy, and don't implement the androcentric economical assumptions of this problematical and ill person of Homo economicus, but look on what are the rationalities and methodological on the methodological level to divide households production from consumption and from behavior and from the individual level. In that way, you can understand what are the drivers of what are the moments where sustainability strategies can go in. Yes, freedom to move for people first instead of products and capital. We know this is well known, and the instrument of the 7 gender dimensions, gender impact assessment, is one of the moments where you can go in new fields of sustainability strategies. And we did it also for the EC Green Deal and so on. You have, this is an instrument for analyzing, but also for discovering the innovative moments where strategies can address and take really acceptable and effective strategies. Thank you very much. Next is only literature if you want to read something.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias. Ahora vamos a pasar al siguiente bloque.
Next, we have a new block. We have Quique Santa María and Sara Díaz de Cerio. Inés Sánchez is not going to participate in the end. So could you please come to the stage? We are now going to talk about a strategic project called In All Fact. ADItech participates in the project, incorporating the gender dimension, as we have also done with 2 more projects in the following call.
Un momento. Okay. No sé si lo veis bien.
Can you see it? Is the picture okay? Thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, thank you, Marusha, and thank you, ADItech, for your invitation. It's my pleasure to share the panel with Sara and the Parkinson's Disease Association in Navarre. I'm going to talk about In All Fact, a project funded by the government of Navarre or Navarra, involving 6 organizations, some of them patient associations. In All Fact is intended to innovate through the smelling sense. In All Fact will include animal experimentation with both mice and rats. It also relies on patients with different patient categories. We're going to analyze different parameters in elderly people. And we are going to study both Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. we are going to apply the smell sense for treatment for several reasons. We know our smell sense is important 15, 20 years before an Alzheimer's disorder or Parkinson's disorder breaks out in a person. We also believe our smelling sense is important as a guide for drug administration and its impact on the brains, because we do know that drugs administered via the bloodstream do not have a very important effect. So as you can see, we're going to use different human samples, animals for experimentation and different technologies. Right, what branches did we have to rely on in INOLFACT? Actually, we were fortunate enough when we drew up the proposal to have ADItech on board. And so they helped us prepare the initial project report. That was very important because it was a guarantee to include the gender dimension. You want to do it from the very, very beginning when you produce your project draft. So we were very lucky to have support from different areas. Researchers are not trained in gender studies, and sometimes we have to even assess previous proposals to prepare ours. I noticed that possibly in certain sections in some calls which were to assess the gender dimension in university or in other organizations, of course, the experts always try to do the best possible job, but they have not been specifically trained. So it's really important for the scientific community to be trained when trying to consider these dimensions. So 3 branches INOLFACT relied on to include the gender dimension. We used the ADItech guide, which is very easy, very straightforward. You know how to apply it in just 3 minutes. It's a very good guide with a number of questions, etc. We also used the guide by the ministry, which helps you a lot for evaluation of your proposal. It tells you about the aspects that are to be considered into your report, and finally, the European guidelines. Gendered innovations too. These guides were used in different parts of the project. It was not easy, to be honest with you. We had a number of discussions. It's not easy to implement a gender dimension when you do your experiments with mice, for instance, or with rats. You have to have female and male animals. The same goes for patients, and that gave way to a very, very fruitful debate. INOLFACT seeks to study the brain immune system smell sense axis at a molecular level, considering different variables, weight, from the immune system. We have hormones which can be inflammatory, pro-inflammatory, and the whole INOLFACT partnership was a bit dubious as the capacity of our smell sense and whether or not it is the same in men and women. So by combining all 3 guides, we covered all of the project. As I said at the beginning, the first ADItech and the ministry guidelines were easy to use at the beginning because they explained why it was worth applying the gender dimension. As I also said earlier, the moment you start talking about gender and the gender dimension, you generate a lot of discussions and you sort of lose your bearings in putting together your project proposal. because you come up with a lot of ideas, and then the idea of applying the European directive or guidelines, it's very useful, but it is a lengthy document. If you search for key terms, key words, you realize the chapters that you want to read in detail. In our case, it was the chapters on experimentation animals and drugs, and also information reporting. So, yes, a lot of questions, a lot of discussions. Yes, let's apply the gender dimension, yes, and then economic feasibility. Okay, we were feasible, and yes, having male and female mice, does it make sense in Alzheimer's disease, in aging, in Parkinson's disease? Does it make sense? Can we have the necessary animal or animalarium infrastructure to have transgenic mice, sick mice, etc.? All these questions we did not have answers for at the very beginning. Very briefly, Alzheimer's and Parkinson's diseases do affect men and women differently. There are differences at, sexual difference in this case. The progression, the development of the disease differs in men and women. So we did have to include the gender dimension. In relation to our smell sense, we were not that proficient, but we did read models using flies, and we know based on that smelling is different in male and female flies, and the same goes for mice. Apparently, males have a different smelling sensitivity from that of women. So this has been proved for experimentation animals, and we wanted to apply it to the immune system and neurodegenerative diseases. Here you can see some thoughts we went through all along the project. On the left-hand side, you see the clinical research aspects. We addressed neurodegeneration and aging aspects. Concerning aging, we included men and women equally, but at whether in a hospital, at home, or in a nursing home. And concerning neurodegeneration, we decided to include the incidence of both disorders in men and women. Thus, because if we decided, for instance, to include 50 women and 50 men in the Alzheimer's group, we would be biased because incidence is not that. It's not 1-1. This information was not very clear socially, but we sort of see that Alzheimer's hits women more, and Parkinson's is more common amongst men. Concerning the basic research and laboratory aspects, some trials had to be made with olfactory cells. This methodology for us was very attractive because obviously the patient's still alive, and we included both men and women in this respect. Concerning animal experimentation, we had a bit of a discussion, as Raul commented on. There is a bias there. More specifically for Alzheimer's disease, some colleagues in all fact would use a particular transgenic model using females only. So if we hadn't applied the gender dimension, we would have continued using the transgenic model of the disease, and we wouldn't have known what happens with this transgenic model on males. So that took some research. We found out that with males, this model is a lot more aggressive. Mice attack each other, even if they are brothers or siblings, and we decided the solution was to separate them in sort of different cells, but that would have made the experiment very expensive because we would have needed a cage for each individual mouse. And don't forget, mice need to socialize too, so there would have been an impact on their behavior. That goes for Alzheimer's disease. Concerning Parkinson's disease, the presence of estrogen seems to have a neuroprotective effect, and so there was a trend, a tendency to use male models. In all fact, we changed models, and we are using models both in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease that allows us to reasonably work both with males and females. To finish with, let me show you a case study or a pilot experiment. These two women work in Navarra in the lab, and we had a bit of a challenge here. We wanted to find olfactory differences in Parkinson subjects and in a control group. If we were to ask this question, as is usually the case in the scientific community, we would have the first question you see here. What proteins change in the olfactory tract in Parkinson's disease versus the control population? This was done with 8 controls and 12 Parkinson individuals. With our analysis, we noticed that 18 proteins change. If we ask the question with the gender dimension included, the question would be as follows: what proteins change in the olfactory tract of men and women with Parkinson's disease versus men and women as controls? In this case, these were the numbers, and as you can see, 64 proteins differed when we compared women, and when we compared with men, it was 65 different proteins. This could be striking because if you do not know what data sets you are using, you ought to get 82. But here things are different, statistics different, and most interestingly, as you can see in the orange circle, there are 3 common proteic alterations when we did it with the gender dimension setup. So, okay, if we now have to continue to take this research line further, I can convince my sponsors a lot better if I take the information at the bottom. Yes, instead of having 82 candidates and I don't know where to start, where to begin. If you want to be more focused, which is what I wanted you to note, we have 3 proteins which would have gone missing in the analysis at the top. Finally, some partners of InolFact would probably disagree, or do it differently, sorry, but in our particular case, this analysis has helped us be more focused, and in fact, there is a PhD dissertation now going on about degenerative diseases, including the gender dimension. And since we are now really into this subject, now as a routine, we are thinking of including this possibility. It's really important not only to be obliged as researchers, but to also involve other staff, laboratory staff, other people also involved in research. It's important for them to take this into account from the very beginning of their careers. That's all from me about InolFact.
Thank you, Enrique. Please stay here as we'll be having a debate later. And now I will give the floor to Sara Díaz de Ceiro. Díaz de Ceiro, please bear with me. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting us to participate here. Also, thank you, Marusha and Enrique. For us, it is essential that there is continuous research. That's our hope and our future challenge, especially in the healthcare sector and in many other sectors affecting our lives, and those affected with Parkinson. So very briefly, what is our association? Well, we were funded 30 years ago to create a bond between affected people. This bond that was useful to feel that this is not just happening to you, but is more common. And that's important to live together better with this condition. In our association, our objective is to care for affected people, and part of this care is information, rehab. We offer integral care, fully comprehensive care for all needs of the affected people. So we have physiotherapy, speech therapy. And with this, I'd like to say that there are 2,000 people living with Parkinson in Navarra. 50%, well, a 50% split between men and women. So it's actually 51% men, 49% women. So people who come to our associations, when we talk about members, we're talking about 58% men and the rest women. But when we are talking about rehab approaches, then we have a 65% of men, which means that socially there is a previous repercussion. There is a certain societal approach bringing women towards a more private space and men to a more public space. So if women do not come, well, we can't work with them, and therefore there is no care, no rehab approach for them, and this affects their quality of life. This is important to consider in the light of future policies that we might draft. Other issues brought up here are essential. Raül talked about the neuroscience side, and this is quite a novelty for us because the Parkinson condition is known for 200 years, and we've seen progress, a great deal of research, but we still don't know the causes. And the gender perspective is, well, it's very recent. It's been only a few years since Enrique and others started working on this. And as my colleagues mentioned, then the estrogens can be very important here, as we are working with those people, those women living with that, who don't have the pharmacological treatments because nobody knows how to guide those treatments, and there is no supporting research. So, as an association, we try to represent these collective and to work so that this research goes along these lines, so that these women can have the best quality of life. Also, on the other side, there is the social or socio-economic side. And we've observed that many women took a long time to come to our association. based on their self-care, as firstly, they are caregivers. And secondly, they feel the need for this self-care. So we need to work on this, and we all know this is a social issue. And as the magistrate said, we need education in gender, in equality. And I think this should be cross-cutting for the whole educational model, not just at university or for the law school. I think this is an issue that we need to work from an early age for all degrees, because it's a cross-cutting issue affecting many aspects of life.
Muchísimas gracias. Yo quería ahora plantearos, porque nos parecía muy interesante.
Thank you very much. Now, well, we think it's very important that, well, we have international speakers from different disciplines, and then seeing tangible examples locally of a collaboration of many entities and bodies with the aim to provide excellent research impacting the whole of society. As we saw with Kike and Sarah, from the biological sex of lab animals to the why women do not go for these therapies and these services provided by your association. Well, women are left behind, they stay at home. And I'd like to ask you, are you optimistic? Was this an eye-opener, this process, this research? Well, from my side, I am optimistic indeed, but this is a long race. So we need to bring down some pre-existing barriers, and I understand that as a researcher, I do miss some training on these issues. At the end of the day, we are based on scientific papers, but I think that if we need to assess and to be assessed critically, at some point I do feel that it was just basically my opinion, and could have been wrong, but I should have complemented my opinion with other nuanced opinions. Yes, I am indeed optimistic, and I think conferences like the one held here are needed, and as Sarah said, not just at the university level, but also permeating society, so that these can progress and become a reality. We have female colleagues who had to leave and mentioned that this thing about pharmacological drugs being just approved in male mice, well, this has a huge impact. Now, if this is a headlines on the if this was a headlines on the news, I guess there will be some reaction in society. And Sarah, how do you see it? Well, along the same lines, I think we should always be optimistic. When it comes to research, well, progress is being made. We obviously need people who want to be involved in research, and it's important that there is funding for research. These are the two mainstays. So if there's the will and the funding, I think the future is in the right way. We hope so. Well, thank you. I don't know if you have any further questions, those here in the audience. And if not, I would like to add, well, I'd like to say thank you very much. I wish that this conference is an eye-opener for, not just for everyone here or online, but for those who have asked whether this will be recorded or placed somewhere. And well, this is the little drip. Drip by drip, we might permeate the brains and mindset of many people so that we all benefit of excellent research. I would like to thank especially Lucía Martínez from UPNA and Cristina Uznarov from Litnaya, even though she's not there anymore, for collaborating on this conference. This was possible partly. This was more of an excellent conference, thanks you to the support, and also thank you to my colleagues from ADItech, Carlota, Carmen, Maria, John, and especially, even more, I have to keep this for last, my former female boss, Paula, without whose support and driving force, I think that throughout the process I would have, dropped it. So thank you. And also thank you to Miriam, the backstage, and Mikel, operating the camera and the audio. This is very tricky. It's the first time we do it from this room at the UPNA. This is a remote or hybrid session with live simultaneous interpretation. So in the light of all these innovations that we had to put on the table, well, thank you, everyone, because together we move forward, maybe more slowly, but we go further. So thank you very much. I'm sure you'll have plenty of questions to reflect upon at home, and you have plenty of resources to look for information and to keep on working on excellent research. Thank you.